Good evening. My name is Ed Lim. I'm an ophthalmologist serving on the executive committee of the Connecticut Society of Eye Physicians and will be your meeting moderator tonight. On behalf of the Connecticut Society of Eye Physicians and the New York State Ophthalmologic Society, I'd like to welcome all of you to the virtual scientific CME regional meeting. We will be joined by dermatology and ENT and other subspecialists to fulfill the Connecticut state requirements for a 1 hour of ethnic competency that is required by the state of Connecticut. You'll receive a separate certificate for your state requirement submission. In a quote by Elie Wiesel, while teaching at Boston University, when asked a question of, where do we start when trying to transform hatred? He answered, and I quote, anyone who is suffering, anyone who is threatened becomes your responsibility. If you can feel this and act with even a little bit more humanity, more sensitivity as a result, that is the beginning. It's not the end. I do not know how to end hatred. I truly wish I did, but recognizing our shared humanity is a good beginning, end of quote. This quote is from the book Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom. And I'm so pleased that we can have as our first speaker tonight, the author of this book, Ariel Berger. Rabbi Berger is an author, teacher, and artist whose work integrates spirituality, the arts, and strategies for social change. His talk is titled, The Otherness of the Other, Elie Wiesel's Lessons on Respect and Constructive Dialogue. Welcome, Rabbi Berger.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you. I'm grateful. I'm grateful when anyone comes together to engage in this kind of learning and exploration at a time of great crisis in our world and in our society. We know that our society here in the US and elsewhere around the world is filled with and really characterized by struggles around the concept of otherness, which we will discuss tonight. We're living in a time of such intense polarization and such extreme digging in of heels and a breakdown in communication and a kind of amnesia when it comes to the skill set involved in constructive dialogue, constructive conflict across difference, whether those differences are ideological or political or differences in style and personal story. We encounter difference every day in the workplace, in our own homes, and in public spaces. And for various reasons, we are struggling mightily to reclaim and recall the art of otherness. It is the otherness of the other which fascinates me. This is something that Professor Elie Wiesel said very often. We all know Elie Wiesel as a Holocaust survivor, the author of Night, someone who lived through arguably the darkest experience in human history and somehow found a way to transmute that experience into a positive force for change, a motivation for decades of activism and human rights work and peacemaking, and very importantly, writing and teaching. He believed somehow in the world and in humanity in spite of his experiences, the deportation of his family from a small town called Siget in Transylvania, first to Buchenwald, where his mother and little sister were murdered, and then to Auschwitz, where his father died. And Elie Wiesel emerged from that experience in many ways broken and filled with a sense of despair, but also filled with a fierce commitment not to give in, not to surrender to that despair. And so if you read Night, I'm sure many of you have, you may recall the very last moment of the book, the very last scene of the book where young Elie Wiesel has been liberated from the camps and is looking in a mirror. And if you remember that scene, he writes, "A corpse was looking back from the mirror, and I shall never forget the look in its eyes as long as I live." A very dark image. And so we might think that someone who lived through such an experience would be forgiven for choosing despair, choosing to give up on humanity, and especially choosing to give up on the other, choosing to give up on anyone who didn't come from his own background as a survivor, his own Jewish background, his own Eastern European Jewish background, we would understand why someone might, or why a community might, choose to circle the wagons and engage in a protective kind of particularism and leave the world to its fate and not engage in any activities that are attempts to better the world, but instead to focus inward on one's own personal success, professional or other success, on one's own family, on one's own community or tribe. And instead, what we find with Elie Wiesel and survivors like him is that while they did choose to have families in general, and they did choose to engage in communal Jewish activities, building synagogues and community centers, they also, in many, many, many cases, far beyond what we would expect in a per capita representational kind of way, were deeply engaged in universal commitments as well. Commitments to human rights, to peacemaking, to civil rights in this country, and in general, to being community members contributing to the larger, wider, more diverse community. What's the secret that allowed a survivor like Elie Wiesel to transform his experience, his confrontation with despair, into an unremitting commitment to the world as a whole, to making the world better, in spite of the fact that the world betrayed the victims of the Holocaust? And it wasn't only the perpetrators, it was those around the world who knew what was happening and refused to engage in the disruption of the Holocaust, the disruption of that genocide. This isn't the time or place to go into that history, but suffice it to say, we know it's a matter of historical record that from the United States government to the Vatican to even many parts of the American Jewish community, leaders did not do enough. Leaders failed to stand up against what was happening in real time. And so rather than give up on the world, Elie Wiesel and many other survivors chose to engage with the world. And not only to engage with the world in some abstract sense, but literally to engage with otherness, to engage in dialogue with people who come from different backgrounds, to invest in teaching and learning in diverse settings, in universities and elsewhere, to create professional associations, dialogue groups, opportunities for people from conflict zones to speak to one another across the abyss of their competing narratives. And this is something that Elie Wiesel specifically did throughout his life. He created opportunities for dialogue, especially between and among people on opposite sides of conflict zones, whether in the Middle East or Yugoslavia or elsewhere. It is the otherness of the other that fascinates me, he often said. I'm so interested, he once said, in precisely the differences between individuals and communities that render them truly astonishing to one another. I'm so interested and curious when I encounter someone who has a very different belief system than I do. I see that as an opportunity. I see that as an invitation. I see the potential for a new friendship, and it's so exciting and beautiful when new friendship emerges from those encounters. Now, this is very, very different from what we often hear and see in our public discourse, in media, and even in the subtle messages that we receive or send about difference. What happens in our society today when we encounter someone with a very different perspective, someone with a very different political perspective, someone whose mission is at odds with our own, someone whose personal story or ancestral history prioritizes issues that we tend to ignore or marginalize? What happens when we encounter someone who truly represents a different worldview? Do we feel threatened? Do we feel that we need to convince or persuade the other? Do we feel that that's our job in that moment of encounter? What do we see modeled for us among politicians and on talk shows? Do we see examples of people who truly hold space for difference? And as much as our organizations and companies and corporations and educational settings are investing in diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings of various sorts, we still have not solved the fundamental problem of the breakdown in communication across difference. And so what I want to discuss tonight is, how do we reclaim that? And what are some hints or tools that we can draw upon from Elie Wiesel and from some of his favorite sources in literature and ancient and modern texts? What are some of the tools and practices that he gave us to do this better? And I want to share, before I dive into that, for those of you who may not know, I had the privilege of studying closely with Professor Wiesel for many years, first as a teenager in New York City in an informal way. He became the person that I, as a questing, very serious young person, went to with all of my very difficult questions about the relationship between religion and the arts. That was a big question in my life. Questions about inclusion of those who are different or differently abled, like my sister, who was born blind and whom I saw from an early age navigate the world without sight, with incredible generosity and creativity and incredible musical sensibility, but also with some of the challenges that come with being different in a community of people who are used to a certain kind of conformity. I had many questions about these things and many other things, about faith and doubt, about how to make personal decisions and career decisions. And Professor Wiesel, with stunning and typical generosity, made a lot of room for this young, somewhat conflicted person to visit him with those questions. It turns out that he loved questions and he celebrated questions. And this is one of the keys to our topic for tonight. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But I just want to share that along those years that we spent together, I became his student at Boston University, where he taught for almost 40 years. And then I became his teaching assistant. I was able to see Professor Wiesel in his role as a teacher help students of all ages and from many parts of the world, many of whom had been in conflict zones, had experienced conflict and war directly, had lost people to war or oppression. He helped them navigate otherness. He helped them learn new languages and new vocabularies and practice new tools for encountering otherness and difference in the classroom first, which was a relatively safe space, but over time out in the world. And over the last 20 or so years, I've had the privilege also of staying in touch with many of these students and hearing how students of Elie Wiesel have learned the lesson that he taught, that the otherness of the other is not a threat, it is an invitation, and how they've applied those lessons and those tools in their lives and in their work across the globe. And it's one of the things that I think about a lot today, because the truth of the matter is there are a lot of us out here in the world who care deeply about dialogue, opportunities for learning from one another, people who are involved in interreligious dialogue, interfaith conversations, interdisciplinary conversations, people who thrive on that encounter with difference, with otherness. But for some reason, the existence, the presence of so many people of goodwill with such a deep commitment to dialogue and to constructive conflict and conversation doesn't translate into a global culture that embraces otherness and that practices conflict and diversity well. And so rather than consider all of the reasons why this may be, I want to jump directly into Professor Wiesel's lessons in order to maximize our time. And you'll hear some ideas, you'll encounter some images, and we'll talk a little bit about some practices as well and tools, specific practical tools that we can use in situations of conflict or difference or diversity, things that can help us to navigate these things more effectively. I want to begin with another quote from Professor Wiesel, where he described our natural tendency to avoid confrontation. As human beings, we are somehow often wired to avoid confrontation. And as he said, this can lead to a politeness that, for the sake of learning, must be challenged. And this is what he said in the classroom. This is why I encourage you to question me, to question one another, and to question your own assumptions. And so the starting point for Professor Wiesel's life, and particularly his work as a teacher and as a peacemaker, was the celebration of questions. And I want to stay here for just a moment because celebrating questions in our society, I think, is somewhat countercultural. We are often from an early age rewarded for having the right answers on a test or in the classroom. When Elie Wiesel was a young child of 5 or 6 years old and he would come home from school, his mother would ask him, "Did you ask a good question today?" She wouldn't ask him, "Did you answer well?" or "Did you do well on the test?" "Did you ask a good question?" He was raised in a culture in his family and in his local community that celebrated questions, that wasn't afraid of questions, and that saw questions as actually more of an opportunity than answers often are. The way Professor Wiesel said this was, answers are dangerous, questions are not. Answers can separate us, questions bring us together. Answers can end the conversation, questions open a new conversation. And for those of you who may have some grounding in other ancient languages, and especially the Hebrew language, he would say, there is God in the question, because the Hebrew word for question contains the word El, which is God in biblical Hebrew. She'elah is a question in Hebrew. So God is in the question. We find God, we find spirituality, we find the transcendent in the question. And although there's always a temptation to jump quickly to answers and to stake out our position, we might engage in the first practice of otherness and constructive dialogue, which is to become more comfortable with questions and to celebrate questions and to practice this in all kinds of ways. So for example, when we are in a work setting and we're trying to problem solve, how much time do we take simply to generate questions? In my work, we practice something called a question storm, like a brainstorm, the purpose of which is to generate the largest quantity of questions possible without any censorship or self-criticism. We are simply trying to generate as many questions as possible. That's step one. And step two, we begin to categorize those questions in a variety of ways to make some order out of those chaotic list of questions. And what we find invariably is that taking the time to celebrate questions, even though we know we're not going to answer all of them or even most of them, and sometimes any of them, is incredibly valuable. It sparks our creativity. It does something to us on a deep nervous system level of giving us permission not to know things. And that pushes against our tendency and our cultural tendency to jump very quickly to knowing things and to exhibiting a kind of mastery of a set of answers to what are often very complex questions that require us to slow down and to live with the questions for a longer period of time. As a young person, when I visited Professor Wiesel over several years and I asked him many of the questions I mentioned earlier, I noticed that he almost never answered my questions. He would respond to my questions with another question very often, or sometimes with a story. And this taught me something very valuable. There's a difference between a question and an answer. There is also a difference between an answer and a response. And so when we take some of the questions that are most enduring, most challenging in life or in history, for example, the extreme experience, Professor Wiesel's own experience of the Holocaust, and we posit a question, what are we to do with such experiences? What are we to make of an experience like that? That was the question he asked himself after the war. What am I to do with my experience of suffering? First of all, this is a good question because it's an open question. There were others, theologians, religious leaders, who asked a different question, which was, what is the reason for the Holocaust? What is the reason for human suffering? And there were religious leaders who offered answers to that question. The Holocaust happened because the Jews were not religious enough, were not observant enough, were not loyal to God. There were rabbis who said this after the war. For Elie Wiesel, this was offensive to the nth degree. How can you possibly justify such suffering? the suffering of innocence, the suffering of 1 million plus children through such an assertion. It's deeply offensive. And so that question doesn't lead us to an opening and a way of living. But the question, what am I to do with my suffering, holds more promise. What am I to do with my suffering? And second, rather than answer that question, he developed responses to that question. An answer is final. It closes the conversation. It ends with a period at the end of a sentence. A response is a way of living or acting or behaving in response to a question that is embodied and ongoing. It is embodied and it is ongoing. And so Elie Wiesel's own life is an example of this. His response to the question, what am I to do with my suffering, my experience of the Holocaust, was a response that extended over the rest of his life, over many decades. And the response was, I am going to work to ensure that it never happens again to anyone. I'm going to work to ensure that the world becomes a little bit more just and a little bit more kind. I am going to make sure that we educate the next generation to be morally sensitive. That is my response. That will be my response to this tragedy. And as he said, tragedy confers no merits. We are not judged by our tragedy, but by our response to tragedy. And so shifting from answer to question and from answer to response, and considering how we live with our search for answers to questions, our comfort with discomfort when we're sitting in the presence of a difficult question, a big question, and it could be a metaphysical question or it could be a practical question. What's the right answer to a professional challenge or a societal challenge? How do we sit with that question and slow down enough to celebrate the questions that emerge from that question and consider our responses rather than only our answers? This is a beginning. Remember that if you and I disagree about something important, and I have my answer and you have your answer, we find ourselves on opposite sides of an issue. And this is what happens so often in human life. It's natural. It's part of what it means to be a part of the human species, filled with diversity of opinions and positions. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. The question is, what do we do next? And if I dig in my heels and try to overcome you or your position, or persuade you of my position, or delegitimize your position, or I engage in personal attacks, then what I'm effectively doing is sealing the distance between us and ensuring that we are never going to find a point of common ground or commonality. And this is, in many respects, why Professor Wiesel believed the world is so filled with conflict. War, yes, but also the smaller, more modest conflicts that tear communities apart, that impact families, that can impact the workplace. We have to cultivate a different approach. And so if you have a different response to a question than mine, our responses can coexist. So Elie Wiesel's response to the Holocaust was to engage in human rights activism, to write novels and nonfiction books, and to teach. Other survivors' responses were to build businesses and engage in their local communities, to write their memoir, to tell their story to their children, to commit to raising their children in a Jewishly informed way to continue the tradition, or to get involved in other causes. There was a vast variety of specific responses of survivors to the experience of the Holocaust. None of those responses contradict. None of those responses render the others invalid. There is a lot of room for a plurality of responses to difficult questions. Not so with answers. So the shift from answers to responses is one element of Professor Wiesel's approach to otherness. There was another thing he taught us, which is really based on a biblical text, which was one of the things he turned to over and over again as an enduring wisdom text in crafting his philosophy of life, his theology, and his practical responses to contemporary pressing issues and questions. He turned to the Bible again and again, as well as other religious texts and secular texts from ancient times and modern times. He loved to teach these texts. And he returned to the Bible and the book of Genesis very often because he saw in those stories the story of the creation and the Garden of Eden, the story of Cain and Abel, essential lessons for our time. And one of the things that he pointed out to us in the classroom was a very mysterious phrase in the story of the creation of the first couple, the first relationship, the first human relationship. And I'm not going to go deeply into the text now, but just to kind of telegraph it, we remember there are actually two creation stories and two versions of the creation of man and woman, Adam and Eve. But in one of them, God says, I'm going to create a helper for Adam because Adam was created alone. And I'm going to create a helper against him. The Hebrew phrase, which is very mysterious, is ezer, which is a helper, kenegdo, against him. Ezer kenegdo, a helper against him. In the King James Bible, I believe this is translated as a helpmeet, M-E-E-T. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but you see the translators are struggling to render this doubled phrase because the phrase itself seems to be contradictory. What does it mean to be a helper against? And so Professor Wiesel taught us that his understanding of this verse, based on earlier Jewish commentaries, is that this is teaching us a model of friendly antagonism, of positive disagreement, of positive otherness, one in which, in order to support you, I challenge you. In order to support Adam, Eve challenges Adam and vice versa. God creates a challenger for Adam in order to help him, because we thrive when we have certain kinds of challenge, sparring partners, conversation partners. But the model of a helper against, an ezer kenegdo, is defined by a very clear intention that the protagonists or the antagonists are engaged in disagreement for the sake of the other. So when I disagree with you in this way, I'm not disagreeing with you because I want to prove my point or win. I'm challenging you because I believe that by challenging you, I'm going to help you to clarify your thinking. Your ideas will become more refined within the bounds of our conversation, within the bounds of our relationship. And as an other, as someone who doesn't think like you, I am disagreeing with you for your sake, not for my own, for your sake, not in order to defeat or silence you, but in order to help you clarify your thinking in a spirit of generosity and commitment and relationship. And in fact, this is, in many traditional Jewish communities, this is the model for text study. When people come together to study the Bible or the Talmud, the rabbinic text from the first centuries to the 6th centuries of the Common Era, that vast repository of law and legend, or any text, the way that people traditionally study in the Jewish community is in pairs. And the pairs, if you ever walk into a study hall where people are engaged in this kind of study, you'll hear that it's very, very loud. And it's very loud because people are yelling at each other. They're challenging each other. They're pushing one another. They're poking holes in the arguments of the other. And when they're done and the study period is over, they get up and high five or shake hands or hug each other, because all of this is done in a spirit of friendship and support. So what does it mean to argue with the other for the sake of the other? I must tell you, this was something I experienced growing up and studying in Jewish spaces. And the most effective study experience I think I've ever had. I've spent a lot of time studying alone for tests or things or in small groups, but the most effective experience of this that I ever had was with a study partner whose style of thinking was so foreign to me, was so different than my own, that every time we sat down together, we drove each other crazy because everything I said sounded like nonsense to him and vice versa. But we were committed to the process. And it turned out over time, we realized we were learning more from one another than from any previous study partner we had ever had. And it was precisely because we thought so differently. Now, this is not the way that conflict is often portrayed or experienced nowadays, but I want to share with you a teaching from a Hasidic master from about 200 years ago, whose name was Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. He lived from the year 1772 to 1810 in Ukraine. He's well known as a storyteller and was very influential for Professor Wiesel. And he was very interested in the subject of conflict and otherness and controversy, in large part because, number one, he experienced a lot of conflict and controversy in his life. He was attacked by many other Jewish rabbinic leaders in the establishment at the time, throughout his life. He was seen as something of a rebel, a revolutionary, and many of the old guard attacked him over and over again. And number two, he saw conflict as a source of creativity. He saw conflict as an opportunity to challenge his own assumptions and to continue to grow and not to become complacent in his own identity or religious project or beliefs. And over the course of his life, he lived until the age of 38 or so, but over the course of his life, he developed a theology of conflict. And one of the things that he teaches is that a moment of conflict, and it can be any experience, it can be in a boardroom, in a classroom, on the street, in a family, any moment in which two people are disagreeing about a subject of importance. What they are doing effectively is creating a space between them. Each one pulls to one side of the issue. Person A is on one side of the issue, person B is on the other, and in between them, there's a space. And Rabbi Nachman says, within that space, new worlds can be created. Radical new creativity can happen. Innovation can happen. New insight can take place, provided the space is held, contained, nurtured in the right way, effectively, by the two participants, the two antagonists in the conflict. Notice that in this model, there are actually two challenges in any situation of conflict or disagreement, two pitfalls to avoid. The first is if we force a kind of conformity, if we force ourselves to agree, if we avoid acknowledgement of conflict, if we pretend, if we are conflict averse and we don't name that we disagree about something, we are collapsing that space. We are collapsing that potential in which new creativity can happen. That is one pitfall to be avoided. The other, of course, is that if we don't sustain the space well enough, it can fall apart. It can explode into violence or alienation. And so what we're trying to do in a situation of conflict is hold a delicate, almost, I imagine it almost as a soap bubble, a kind of space defined by a soap bubble that can burst in a moment, can be stretched too thin and burst in that direction. And our job is to maintain and nurture that space very carefully. I offer this as an image for contemplation because I have found it useful in situations where my wife and I disagree about the dishes, or I'm dealing with a professional conflict or issue, to imagine that we are not antagonists really. We are actually partners in holding and nurturing and defining a space in which perhaps something new can happen, some new insight can happen, can be very, very effective and liberating and helpful. But it has to be internalized. So I offer this image of the soap bubble that you and your antagonist are holding together. Perhaps there's someone with whom you're disagreeing now in your life. Imagine that you are partnering on this very delicate project of holding the space for new creativity. And work with that image, stay with that image, and see if and how it's helpful in those moments of conflict and disagreement. The question, of course, is on a very practical level, how do we create such a space, and how do we hold such a space, such a vessel? What does that actually mean? It's a very powerful image, but what does it look like in practical terms for us to hold that space, for us to hold a space for conflict, that is generative, for disagreement which is creative and opens new possibilities, what would you build that vessel, that space with? What are the elements that you would bring to such an experience? What personal qualities or character traits do you think are useful in holding that space? I'm going to pause for a moment and give you just a moment to think about that question. Notice what comes to your mind. What are the elements that you think are essential for building, holding, sustaining that kind of space? Perhaps it's humility. Perhaps it's humor. Perhaps it's deep listening. Maybe it's something else. But to begin to catalog the elements, the practices, the design principles, the personal qualities and character traits that allow us to hold that space, rather than becoming triggered, either avoiding conflict and surrendering to another position, conforming to another position, or allowing the space to explode into anger or alienation or real conflict, destructive conflict. What does it take to hold that space? And I want to respond to that question, but I also want to leave that question for you to think about over time, because I think it's one of the most important questions for us today. If we can begin to catalog some of those practices, I think we'll be in better shape than we are now. I want to share some of the tools and practices that I have found helpful, and these are some very practical, specific tools from a document that we've created. I've been working on this for probably 20 years or so. It comes out of two experiences in my life. One is doing my doctoral work in conflict transformation and considering how we can draw upon various human wisdom traditions from religious texts and philosophical texts and history to engage in conflict transformation more effectively. And the second experience was when I was living in Israel for several years, and I was involved in dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians, and others, but primarily Jewish Israelis and Muslim and some Christian Palestinians, and had two experiences of conflict transformation efforts and peacemaking efforts during those years. The first was not very effective. The first was attempts to impose a kind of peaceful dialogue from a modern Western perspective. And this was where peacemakers from the West, from usually Western European countries, would come in, gather groups of Israelis and Palestinians, and tell them the story that the organizers wanted the participants to adopt. But this was not really very effective. And I saw this over several years. By contrast, the second approach I saw, which was extremely effective, was when people came together from multiple sides of the conflict and told stories and shared their own personal experiences, as well as the experiences of their own traditional texts from the Bible and the Quran, and sometimes elsewhere, that were most important for them as sources of values and belief systems. And to engage in that kind of conversation, as well as sharing some practices together, meditating together, singing together, being silly together eventually, that kind of multimodal experience of dialogue was much more effective. And so what I'm going to share with you comes out of several of those experiences. And I'm not going to share this, every single one of these tools, but I just want to sort of highlight several of them that I think are immediately usable, practical, and that I use myself very often. And it's important to say that several of these are designed for the moments before we engage in conflict and difficult conversations. And I want to just underscore here, this is coming up a lot in my work and my experience of others, precisely in the realm of diversity training, where some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion training that I've been witnessing recently creates space for people to explore issues and questions, but also often comes with some assumptions about ideology, which can be triggering for people who are involved in these workshops and professional space conversations. And so rather than creating space for more dialogue and conversation and mutual understanding, and rather than contributing to a more humanly sensitive environment, very often people walk away. In my recent experience, and I don't mean to generalize, but I've seen this several times in just in the last month and a half or so, people walk away from the experience feeling more threatened, less understood than before. And so the question of how we engage in these conversations about diversity, difference, not only differences that we've identified as critically important of race and religious background and gender and so on, but also differences in style and personality type, those things play in to the experience of these trainings and often go unnamed. We have to consider how to do this work effectively going forward. So some of these tools are for before those moments of conflict. Many of them are for the moment of conflict itself, a difficult conversation, a Thanksgiving dinner with people from across the political spectrum, where you know that 2 years ago, before the pandemic, Thanksgiving dinner ended in disaster for many people, with a relative storming off. How do we do it this year with a better outcome? And some of the tools are for afterwards, for after the moment of conflict. And so just to highlight a few of these tools, and then as we go, please capture your questions. We'll have some time for Q&A. And it's important to not lose those questions. So I want to begin with tools for constructive conflict for before you begin. And here's one tool that I have found extremely, extremely useful. If there's one tool I leave you with, I think it would be this one that I would want you to try out. And it is very simple, but can be really transformative. And it is to lay out what success would look and feel like in the conversation we're about to have, and reverse engineer the conversation. Take some time before the conversation, before the encounter, before the conflict, to ask, if I were looking back at the conversation from a week from now, or from the vantage point of a month from now, what would allow me, and ideally, what would allow both of us to look back and see this conversation as a successful, positive conversation? Would it mean, would I feel good about this conversation if I look back and said, I learned something, or I was challenged in a respectful way to look into something that I haven't really researched that now I'm excited to look into? Or maybe quite simply, my interlocutor and I feel more connected at the end of the conversation than we did at the beginning of the conversation. You get to define the terms of success, but what would success look and feel like to you? Try to imagine what it feels like as well in the body, not just intellectually, from the vantage point of a week or a month from now, looking back. And then think, well, what would it take to get us there? And spend some time contemplating that. This is a very generative prompt before difficult conversations. One more pre-conflict tool. Establish in advance, what are we going to do if someone gets triggered? It's likely that if the conversation means anything, if there are real stakes here, that someone at some point is going to get triggered. What are we going to do? What's the procedure we want to have in place for that moment? It might be to pause and take some deep breaths. It might be to keep a parking lot and write down those issues or challenges so that we know we can come back to them. It might be to use humor. It might be to pause and create a space just to listen. What triggered you? What are you feeling right now? What happened over there? I noticed that you kind of shut down. And to take time for that before going back to the primary conversation. I recognize that some of this is difficult to do in professional settings. Some of this is countercultural or can be seen as too soft or strange or just not sort of part of the accepted norms of behavior around here. But within the range and bounds of what is possible, and maybe pushing the bounds a little bit, making space to consider what to do when someone gets triggered can be very helpful and can be reassuring before going into a difficult conversation. Here are some tools for constructive conflict and dialogue in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the conflict and the conversation. One is to always argue with the steel person, what's usually the opposite of what's usually called the straw man. I call the straw person. Argue with the steel, not the straw person. Argue with the strongest, not the weakest version of your opponent's position. Stick with I language as much as possible. And this is very typical in many circles. This is an essential part of nonviolent communication, if you're interested in exploring that more. But I would add to that, notice the uses, your own and your opponent's use of first, second, and third person. And by the way, this is a tool for reading the news or paying attention on social media to how people are engaging in important issues. Are we engaging with others with a capital O in the first person? Do you see people, pundits or essayists, writing about their own experience? Are they addressing people in other communities in the second person, or are they writing about others in the third person, which can be acceptable, certainly, but sometimes can lead towards a subtle dehumanization of that community. And so just paying careful attention to the use of first, second, and third person can be instructive. Going back to something we spoke of earlier, ask more questions. It's a very, very powerful tool to say, I want to just pause here and articulate some of the questions that are on my mind. And they could be questions about your position, your experience. They could be questions about the issue at hand. They could be questions about my own experience and how I'm interpreting that experience. But the shift away from seeking an answer or a solution or the right policy right away, we're going to have to get there, but making time and space for asking questions can be very valuable. One more thing, in the midst of a moment of conflict or disagreement, look for the story behind the argument. You can't always do this, but sometimes you can ask, well, how did you arrive at this position? Why did you arrive at a position that to me seems contradictory to my value system? I want to understand you better. So before we argue about the actual question at hand, I want to know more about how you arrived at your position. What's the story? And maybe that can be instructive because every position has a story behind it. And shifting from position and policy to story can shift us from judgments and the reinforcement of the conflict to a kind of humanizing element in the conversation. Maybe you have a life experience, or your parents did, or your grandparents, or your background is a way of softening the conversation and understanding with more empathy where you're coming from. And finally, this is more of an intellectual technique, and it's not rocket science, but try switching sides at some point in the conversation in a kind of playful way. Suggest that if you can do this in the context and the setting that you're in, try switching sides in order to practice great flexibility in your own thinking. And after the moment, after the conversation, reflect appreciation, name the places that are unresolved, make a plan to meet again, because we often feel pressure to resolve everything in these conversations, and it's usually impossible to do that. These things, especially if we're dealing with complex questions of policy or practicality, take time, and they usually will not happen in one conversation. Sometimes we are under immense time pressure to make at least a provisional decision, but acknowledging that we can continue this conversation, we don't have to figure everything out right now, can be very, very valuable. And one last thing, while you're having the conversation, it's very useful to pay attention not only to the thoughts that you're having, not only to the feelings that are coming up, but to your embodied experience. How's your breathing? How's your heart rate? Are you getting triggered? Can you slow down your breathing in order to be more present in the moment and in the conversation, and therefore to create more space to do your part in holding that vessel, that soap bubble, which is so delicate and so powerfully, potentially fruitful. One last thought before we open to your questions. I've shared this story publicly, so you may have heard it, but we had a moment in the work that I do now in something called the Witness Institute, which is an institute dedicated to training the next generation of moral leaders based on Elie Wiesel's teaching and approach and personal example. And we had a moment at a gathering where it was an online gathering. We had an hour together, and this was right after the January 6th insurrection. And so the issues that were coming up in the conversation were becoming very heated. And we had a great diversity of people by design in these gatherings, in this gathering, like all of our gatherings, because we're really committed to not creating echo chambers. We want to have diversity of opinion and position and ideology. And so it got heated. And that was okay. The problem was we were running out of time. We had 4 minutes left to the meeting by the time everyone had said what they needed to say. And 4 minutes to the end, 4 minutes to the hour, here we are with a lot of tension, a lot of heat in the room, the Zoom room, and not really enough time to go into the stories behind the positions or to explore other ways of looking at the issues or the conversations and the questions or resolving anything really. And so I thought, as the facilitator, I thought, what would Professor Wiesel do in a moment like this with 4 minutes left? And what came to me, which was surprising, was that he would sing. And so I suggested to the group, I acknowledged we haven't resolved all of this. I know that there's a lot more to say. And I know that it might feel uncomfortable not to resolve everything that we've just raised, but we don't have time to resolve everything right now. We'll meet again and do that soon. But in the meantime, let's sing. And we sang for the last 3.5 minutes. We sang a wordless melody, very easy, accessible melody. And everyone who was at the meeting wrote to me afterwards and said that was an incredibly healing experience. And it reminded me of a teaching, again, of the same Hasidic master who gave us the image of the soap bubble, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who said that when two people speak at the same time, it's cacophony. But when two people sing together, it can be harmony. And so what would it look like to shift our civic discourse from words to melody? What would it look like to restore melody to our public conversations, literally and figuratively? What would it look like to not only consider the facts, the arguments, and the policy positions, but the melody behind all of those positions, the ways in which we can come together and connect as human beings literally through music, more broadly through the arts, through personal sharing and storytelling, in order to rebuild the bonds of connection that allow us to then hold space for constructive conflict and dialogue. Professor Wiesel said it is the otherness of the other which fascinates me. It is precisely the places of difference and disagreement that offer the best opportunity we have for learning, for deepening our own thinking, for challenging our assumptions, for making our biases visible to us. Let's embrace that, and let's be very thoughtful and playful in experimenting with constructive conflict from now on. Thank you all. I would love to hear your questions now.
Such a wonderful talk. Thank you, Rabbi Berger. So I encourage people to submit their questions either in the question and answer box or in the chat box. Deb, do we have a way so that people can ask themselves, if possible? I have a few comments here and a question. One comment that we have is that disagreements today do not inspire and further relationships. They result in contempt, disrespect, and the end of long-standing relationships. Would you like to comment on that?
That is the driving motivation behind all of this thinking. I see it too, I experience it too, and it's painful to watch, it's painful to participate in, and I think it's quite possible for us to do this differently and to do this better, but it requires some real creativity and some real commitment. And the question to me is, where does the rubber hit the road? Where does it become really difficult for us to change these kinds of behaviors? what's really at a very practical, granular level, what allows, I'll start with myself, what allows me in a moment when I'm feeling triggered or threatened by someone else's cockamamie position, right? Something that I think is just totally crazy and ridiculous. What allows me to engage differently in some sort of productive way that doesn't lead to contempt and a breakdown in relationship and communication without necessarily agreeing with their position at all, right? What allows me to do that? And so some of the things I've shared with you are a response to that very question.
Another comment is elements needed to hold that space around the conflict that you discussed. You mentioned deep listening and how that can be so important. We as physicians are programmed to collect data, make decisions, and act. And how sometimes it is really just to change the pattern and listen, as you said, listen deeply.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, this is, first of all, thank God for all of you making decisions on the fly that are saving people's lives and qualities of life. I mean, this is really essential. And so one of the meta questions in all of this, and one of the things we talk about a lot in our work and in the Witness Institute, and it's one of the most difficult challenges, is when do we speed up and when do we slow down? And how do we really hold the tension between those two moves? Sometimes when there's suffering that's preventable, I don't have the luxury or the moral vacation space to say, I'm going to think about this for a few weeks and consider all sides of the issue, right? This is part of what happened, the kind of dawdling response to the Holocaust and other genocides. And today we are called upon to react and respond thoughtfully and quickly with alacrity to situations in our own local communities. If I see something on the street, I see someone suffering or hungry, I need to respond immediately. I can't slow down. On the other hand, we sometimes react so quickly and then look back and realize that we didn't really consider something essential and we ended up causing more harm than good. And this happens a lot. And it even happened to Professor Wiesel in at least one case that he spoke about publicly, where he visited prisoners in Yugoslavia. And as a result of his visit, they were mistreated further as a sort of punishment for meeting with someone from the West, in spite of the assurances that he had received from the corrupt general in charge of these camps. And so he took this question very seriously. How do we make sure that we're not actually causing more harm than good in our kind of righteous indignation and quick response? And this is one of the core tensions in the work, I think, of moral leadership and moral education today, is really wrestling with the question of how and when to speed up, how and when to slow down, and most difficult of all, how do we engage in those moments when we are called upon to do both at once, to hold a space at one and the same time for contemplation, dialogue, a plurality of views, a deep analysis of and search for more data around the issues, that kind of contemplative process, and at the same time to act in an aggressive, clear, perhaps provisional way. That is a very difficult thing to do, a difficult tension to hold. But we are finding that it's both necessary at times and possible at times to develop both of those muscle groups and to use them with a lot of discernment. And so I'm offering that not as an answer, but as a response and a new set of questions. How do we do both of those things in moments when we're called upon to do both?
And we have a question: how can you resolve polarizing issues such as abortion or climate change?
Well, this is where the presenting issues come up, I'd say 80% of the time in our public life and often in our professional settings and families as well. Those are the instances, the occasions for conflict and disagreement. And those are very, very fraught issues with a lot of emotional investment in them from various sides of those issues. And so I think that, I know this is a misquote attributed to Einstein, but maybe someone can enter the correct quote, but the popularization of it is, you can't solve a problem on the level of the problem. And so, I think often what we do is we try to solve or resolve an issue like abortion without attending to the underlying dynamics of the encounter itself. And so if you and I are on opposite sides of that issue, what ends up happening is there's a lot even perhaps the majority of what's happening between us goes unspoken. It's not articulated or named at all. So the fact that I might have an emotional investment in a religious tradition, you might have an emotional investment or a traumatic experience that drives your position, or the models, the moral models that inform us, our parents, our grandparents, our teachers, are very different and held very different positions, or the experience of witnessing someone suffer through a life experience has shaped my position on abortion or any other issue. All of those subterranean things are invisible to us, but they're exerting a tremendous gravitational pull. And astronomers will tell us that when you see a planet or any extrasolar body wobbling, it tells us that there's something exerting a gravitational pull, and astronomers can often calculate that there's a large mass or planet or black hole or something that's invisible, but it's there and it's exerting that kind of force. We have a lot of black holes in our conversations, and I think part of the job that we have is to name them and find ways of making space to name them. It doesn't have to be all touchy-feely, but it has to be kind of human, because we are human beings and we aren't robots, and we don't just have positions that are pure mathematical calculations based on data. Having said that, I also want to emphasize that it's quite possible to really, and this is what Rabbi Nachman is describing in the soap bubble image, it's quite possible, and I would say even necessary and legitimate, to inhabit my position while I'm doing all of this work, right? So in other words, I may be fiercely pro-choice and you may be fiercely pro-life, let's say, and we are inhabiting those two opposite or opposing positions. It's possible to, I'm mixing metaphors here, I apologize, but it's possible to sort of build a tunnel from my position to your position, which is that space for all of the underlying dynamics, the stories, the humanizing practices, to make the conversation more effective without giving an inch on the issue itself. So I'm not saying that I'm going to allow you to persuade me of anything. Maybe you will. I want to be open-minded, but maybe you won't. And maybe I'll persuade you of something, and maybe I won't at all. But there's a whole other level of conversation happening, which is about the human experience, the emotional investment, the stories behind the position, the use of language, and fundamentally our commitment to creating a conversation which is going to be productive and fruitful, that can coexist with neither one of us changing our positions an iota in this conversation. I think that's really important. And in a sense, that's really the definition of pluralism, that I inhabit my position, I'll fight for it, I'll use data, I'll make the strongest arguments I can make, and I'll continue to do so. I also hold a space for your existence and your otherness, and I don't need to cancel you or destroy you or erase the memory of your position. Just the opposite. I'm grateful to you as a conversation partner, even if I find your ideas abhorrent, and vice versa.
Thank you. So helpful. We have another question. What is the role of decreasing our reliance on or engagement in social media as a means of encouraging deeper interactions in all avenues of our lives? Considering the algorithms designed to divide us, this seems like a place to start.
I think that's absolutely correct. And it's a well-known fact that social media tends to exacerbate these dynamics by creating more echo chambers. There are ways to reset your social media settings at times to try to ameliorate some of that, but I think ultimately there's no substitute for some version of face-to-face dialogue. And that can be online, that can be on a Zoom, like we're doing now, it can be in person. But I think it's absolutely correct that the starting point is the default setting of our human society today is echo chambers and no modeling of constructive encounters with otherness. And so if we want to have that, we need to be active in designing and creating those spaces. It's not going to happen automatically. No one's going to do it for us. Social media is certainly not going to do it for us. But I think we each, as citizens, need to take responsibility for our civic role in creating, modeling, holding space for dialogue and disagreement more effectively.
I so appreciate your time, Rabbi Berger, for being here with us tonight. There are some other questions in the chat group. If you wouldn't mind taking a look at those and answering them. We're out of time tonight. Hopefully we can get you back into our grasp in the future for future meetings. Our next speaker is going to join us by way of a pre-recorded video presentation and will be present for questions live at the end of the video. He's so well known to us that he needs a little introduction, but deserves great recognition. Ike Ahmed is a recognized expert, an innovator, renowned for his skills in the advancement of glaucoma surgery and the management of complex surgical cases. I point you to his narrative in the bio section of your program for a full listing. He currently holds leadership positions in Toronto, Ontario, and Salt Lake City, Utah. Dr. Ahmed's recording is going to address the issue of MIGS patient selection, surgical techniques and visualization, and current innovations in his talk titled Glaucoma, MIGS, and Beyond. Let's go to the video recording.
Ike Ahmed from the Moran Eye Center, University of Utah, and Prism Institute, Trillium Health Partners at University of Toronto. I'm happy to speak about MIGS and where we are and beyond. These are my disclosures. There are many different companies that I work with in the glaucoma space and the MIGS space. So many years ago, about 12 years ago, we came up with a term to describe a new genre of glaucoma procedures that were differentiated from the traditional approaches like trabeculectomy, and this is what we called MIGS. The term evolved initially calling it minimally invasive glaucoma surgery to microinvasive glaucoma surgery, describing the small type of procedures we do compared to other parts of medicine. And this continues to evolve today. Now, these procedures are generally grouped as procedures that are typically ab interno, minimally traumatic, primarily physiologic, and at least have some modest efficacy. But one of the differentiating factors compared to traditional surgeries is the extremely high safety profile and the rapid recovery postoperatively. The American Glaucoma Society, as well as other societies, have attempted to create some classification systems for MIGS. There are some inconsistencies and there are some attempts to group some of these procedures together. But in general, you can see a differentiation between MIGS procedures and traditional glaucoma procedures, and they can be differentiated whether they're bleb forming or non-bleb forming, whether they're trabecular meshwork versus superciliary versus aqueous production, and whether they are stenting procedures with devices versus dilation versus cutting procedures. Now, in terms of the new outflow pathways and traditional approaches to filtering surgery, we can describe these based on outflow. Mixed procedures, primarily, we talk about Schemm's canal procedures, which can be done by stenting, viscodilation, or admitted or trabeculotomy. And superciliary procedures, of which there are currently no ones available on the market today, CyPass was withdrawn, but there are a couple of newer options coming down the pipeline. And that's kind of what we call MIGS currently, these ab interno physiologic procedures draining into the canal versus the superciliary space. These are non-bleb forming. As opposed to these procedures, micro-invasive bleb surgery or MIB surgeries are subconjunctival procedures, for example, microstenting procedures that are alternative to or complementary to trabeculectomy. And this division is more recent to differentiate the differences between MIGS and MIBS, and we'll go into this a little bit further. One can also further consider these procedures based on the level of IOP lowering on average, what we achieve. We know phaco can lower pressure modestly. Trabeculectomy is the most potent procedures, and this is kind of where MIGS and MIBS fits in terms of pressure lowering as well as medication reduction. Now, when we think about the traditional treatment paradigm, and this is currently changing, of course, with the world of interventional glaucoma, we have medications and lasers, which have been shown to have high degree of safety, often used typically with less severe patients, as opposed to trabeculectomy and tubes, which are used primarily in patients who have more severity, but of course, there's certain morbidity and issues with that. This is where MIGS procedures, again, typically earlier in severity, earlier in treatment paradigm, and MIBS procedures, which are more sort of in the middle to later in the paradigm, may be considered. And this kind of can be grouped together as part of the approach of interventional glaucoma. Now, both MIGS and MIBS are designed to address different patient populations. I guess I would say there are two models that we try to address. The patient with mild to moderate disease who doesn't need an aggressive procedure but is facing adherence issues, quality of life issues, not doing well with drops, the progression risk, and certain populations that particularly don't do as well with trabeculectomy that may do reasonably with these procedures are procedures that MIGS are trying to address, as opposed to patients who are facing major surgery, have moderate to advanced disease or progressing, and are looking for something maybe that is not as aggressive and potentially taxing as trabeculectomy. Well, there are a variety of different approaches with trabecular meshwork MIGS procedures, as mentioned earlier, and these all range from stenting procedures to viscodilation to ab-internal trabeculotomy or goniotomy procedures, and there is a plethora of approaches and ideas around this. We can consider these approaches here, and some of the trade names of some of the procedures that are available in the current marketplace here are listed here, and each have their own way that they attempt to bypass the trabecular meshwork and address Schemm's canal, where, of course, is the major site of pathology in glaucoma. When we think about stenting versus dilation versus cutting, we can consider these procedures based on the trauma and fibrotic risk response, hyphema formation in the early postoperative period, synechia risk and potentially the need for pilocarpine, pressure lowering, and body of evidence. And this is kind of my own sort of personal opinion about where things are at in terms of the level of these factors and issues that we consider. Just talking about MIGS and outflow, it's really important to consider what we're trying to achieve here. I look at this in three different ways. The first primary focus, and this has been the predominant consideration here, is to overcome the obstruction and or bypass the resistance at the level of trabecular meshwork. And that's kind of the primary motive for these procedures. Secondarily, when we consider dilation and expansion of canal of Schlemm, there's evidence that the canal collapses in chronic glaucoma, and by dilating or expanding it, this can address some of that underlying pathology, either primary or secondary. And then there is the distal outflow pathway, for which we still have to consider what's happening back here. This may be the site of secondary problems that may occur, although traditionally we don't consider glaucoma to be a problem of distal outflow. Perhaps it is, particularly on a secondary nature. And so we need to consider this approach. And so considering these angle trabecular meshwork procedures, we can consider these at three different levels of resistance that we need to consider in an attempt to restore normal physiologic function into that distal outflow tree, episcleral venous system, and the outflow. So considering all this, we are attempting to try to maximize mixed techniques, and we do this by maximizing mechanisms of action and area as well. Let's remember that aqueous outflow is primarily segmental. Aqueous flows through trabecular meshwork, through the canal, into the collector channels and aqueous veins, more as a bypass rather than circumferential flow. And for this reason, we need to consider where we look at bypassing the trabecular meshwork. And some of our ideas are to try to identify some of these aqueous veins, which are larger super channels coming off the canal rather than some of these small micro canal collector channels that lead into more of a high resistance plexus. And if we can identify some of these larger aqueous veins, there's typically 3 to 4 in any given individual. Each single vein has a capacity to drain 1 microliter of aqueous per minute on average. And so if we can hit a couple of these, potentially we can really address the resistance and restore normal resistance and aqueous outflow. These veins are not always easily identified. We can look at this example where we see some trilaminar flow with an episcleral vein leading into an aqueous vein, and this can identify an area where we may want to consider bypassing here in this case. There are gonioscopic clues that may be helpful. Typically, pigmentation is found in areas that have traditionally been higher flow in the past for patients, and also focal blood reflux may give us an indication where we want to consider placing these bypasses if we're deciding to do a segmental trabeculotomy or stenting procedure in this area. Studies in the past have shown that the majority of patients have a preponderance of aqueous veins present in the infranasal quadrant primarily and inferiorly, and so if we're going to focus an area that we want to bypass in the canal, in the trabecular meshwork outflow system, we want to focus into that infranasal quadrant predominantly. So there's been some debate, do we need to do a 360-degree trabeculotomy to obtain the lowest pressure lowering when we do a mixed procedure in trabecular meshwork? I think this is somewhat debatable, considering this lack of circumferential flow, but considering also that data, certainly on the theoretical model, as well as some other basic science models, in that typically once we get past 4 clock hours of trabecular meshwork removal, the total resistance basically plateaus here. And so this kind of explains to us perhaps that there's a limitation in terms of how much we can really obtain by further removing trabecular meshwork because of the inherent resistance within the outflow system beyond the canal. For this reason, many of us have moved more toward doing 180 degrees trabeculotomy, certainly at least for adults, and what we would call maybe a hemi-GAT procedure to still obtain reasonable pressure lowering without necessarily opening up the entire canal and increasing the risk of ifema and other issues. And for this reason as well, we're moving toward, when we're stenting, toward larger stents and multiple stenting to access a broader area of collector channels and overcome resistance to a greater level in these cases. We'll consider mixed tips and looking at success here, some of the factors that are important at consideration of both ocular factors and surgeon factors. And like anything else, patient selection is really important. Visualization and positioning is key to get the right approach in doing these procedures here. And as I said earlier, area and location matters, at least to a certain extent. We do believe that hyphemas are not ideal, and early postoperative management is important. And remember that distal outflow resistance and the remaining resistance and function and tissue healing can significantly affect the outcomes long term. We need to consider this in terms of selection procedure, but also future vistas for research. Predictors of success, I think that in what we consider here, and this may relate to the potential for patients to have distal outflow disease, which I think is more common in more advanced optic nerve disease. We look at severity. Patients with mild to moderate, I think, have a greater success rate in mixed procedures in this area, less drop load. Drops potentially have a toxic effect on the collectors, on the aqueous veins and conjunctiva, and this may be a factor as well. Patients who have had a glaucoma for a longer, shorter duration, patients who have more of a secondary nature of glaucoma, we call these the proximal glaucomas, who have trabecular meshwork dysfunction at that level, like pseudoexfoliation, pigment dispersion. Younger patients, typically, again, for reasons we mentioned earlier. And, the question is 180 degrees versus 360. I think there's still some debate whether there's a difference here. And I also believe that minimizing postoperative hyphemas is important as well for predicting success. This video just shows where some of us are going in terms of what I call combination trabecular meshwork mixed procedures, where we're using a combination of both viscodilation, cutting procedures, as well as stenting. And here we're using the iTrack catheter here after performing goniotomy, passing the catheter here 360 degrees around the entire canal through the canal of Schlem 360 degrees. And this can be done by different approaches, including a suture. But the light tip beacon that also can allow us to inject viscoelastic, and this may be helpful in terms of the injection of a high molecular weight viscoelastic under pressurized injection. As we're doing this, we're injecting here into the canal, into the collector system. This may help to relieve some of the distal outflow obstruction here. And you can see the viscoelastic being injected 360 degrees. And then in this case, we're going to perform as well about 180 degrees inferior ab-internal trabeculotomy here using the micro forceps. And typically when I do this, I do them infranasally, inferiorly, to try to hit where we feel are the largest and most important aqueous outflow channels. And so we've now performed 180 degrees ab-internal trabeculotomy. So we've now done a cutting procedure with the viscodilation. And then to add some stenting options here, we do this because we feel perhaps there's a greater durability of maintenance of patency here, reducing some of the scarring that may occur with the cutting approaches that are done. And so we maximize what I believe are the approaches of both viscodilation to address the distal outflow in the canal, cutting to address the trabecular meshwork directly over a large area, particularly infranasally, and then stenting to provide more of a durable patency in the system. And this is particularly, I think, helpful for some of the patients who have more moderate disease, and particularly standalone patients where we have a higher level of need and an increased threshold for pressure lowering. A lot of questions about does MIGS work? We're happy to see more publications that have been coming through over the many years since the initiation here. And some of the largest glaucoma surgical trials ever published here in high quality studies with various devices we've seen published. And if we look at sort of a very simple way, in a meta-analysis way, to look at these, we see most procedures, all procedures, lower pressure and lower medication use to certain degrees. Although in the mixed population, these are typically into the mid-teens with some medication reduction depending on how many meds. If a patient's on multiple meds, they're probably not going to get off all their meds. But if they're on one or two, perhaps they can. We've seen some very interesting data over the long run, for example, from the Horizon trial, showing the percent improvement of patients medication-free, about a 30% delta here in patients who've had phaco with a mixed procedure like the Hydrus versus phaco alone. This is a value for patients in terms of quality, adherence, and other aspects. And we've also now shown over 5 years that the addition of MIGS with cataract surgery reduces the need for major surgery like trabeculectomy compared to patients who had cataract surgery alone when we have glaucoma present. And remember, these are mild to moderate patients, and so we can really protect patients by adding mixed procedures to them. Interesting as well, we've now shown recent data that we reduced visual field progression. So this is a protective effect here by the addition of adding mixed procedure, 50% reduction of progression over 5 years, and particularly those patients who are maybe more fast progressors, which are hard to predict which ones maybe or maybe not. So there's certainly a lot of value, I think, particularly where most of the work has been done combining MIGS with cataract surgery. Just briefly, we've seen a lot of discussion around suprachoroidal outflow, and we know the potential large gradient. The question is, can we balance safety and efficacy here? Perhaps we have a greater pressure lowering compared to trabecular procedures, but without creating a bleb. These are procedures that are potentially prone to tissue healing, and there's some variability, but we don't have the limitation of the distal outflow system that we see in trabecular meshwork procedures and canal procedures. Of course, right now we don't have any procedures that are available in this high pass with withdrawn, but we are going to see these new procedures come through with novel devices in this area. Remember, we talked about where MIPS fits and where MIGS fits relatively in terms of pressure lowering. And remember, it's important to remember that most MIGS procedures are not designed to replace trabeculectomy. And I look at this as an example in the cardiology world when we compare coronary artery bypass compared to angioplasty and stenting. There are different patient populations that may benefit from these, and they both have a role in the paradigm for treating patients, for example, with coronary artery disease. When we consider glaucoma patients, of course, we consider, do we bleb or not to bleb? And that's often a very common question in my clinic. And we know that there are both old and new subconjunctival bleb drainage procedures. Of course, traditional surgery is the most powerful procedure we have in glaucoma. Trabeculectomy has shown strong efficacy over time. But traditional filtering surgeries, of course, have a number of potentially serious, although rare, complications that can occur, both early but also long-term as well. These patients these procedures have a lot of power, and they're best for lowest pressure, but they have a very invasive and lengthy postoperative course that we all know. They affect the ocular anatomy and physiology in different ways long-term, and they create bleb-related problems. The impact on short and long-term quality of life also is a factor as well, and so this makes us resistant and less likely to offer these procedures to patients earlier in disease unless we really have to, and that really describes what the issues with trabeculectomy are. It's an important surgical procedure. We don't want to bash trabeculectomy, but we do know that it has significant uncertainty, risks, and morbidity and recovery, and for this reason, it's not a procedure that is done very often. I think that we're moving toward trying to differentiate the modern-day bleb to still maintain long-term efficacy, but have an improvement on visual acuity and refractive recovery, improve overall post-op recovery and post-operative intensity in interventions, and have better bleb morphology, provide a more consistent technique and a reduced post-operative variability. And this is kind of the genre of MIPS procedures. I kind of separate these from MIGS because they are different procedures. They have a different level of pressure lowering and a different risk profile than the classical MIGS trabecular meshwork procedures or supraciliary procedures. But they have some features of MIGS procedures that differentiate it from trabeculectomy. And this is kind of a merger of standardizing and microstenting bleb surgery. Both the Zen gel stent and the PreserFlow microshunt are both options as well. Remember how, again, differentiating MIBS from MIGS, I think is helpful to do this. And both the Zen and the PreserFlow are both devices in this space. The Zen traditionally has been placed through an ab interno closed conjunctiva approach, while the PreserFlow is performed with an ab externo open conjunctiva approach. And we're continuing to evolve and learn from these procedures, and we've learned a lot in terms of understanding the difference in physics of subconjunctival outflow between microstenting versus scleral flap, like a trabeculectomy, versus tube shunts. And understanding these differences will be important to maximize efficacy in these procedures. For example, we have a lot of debate, where is the right place to place these MIPS procedures in the subcon space? Is it subtenons, intratenons, supratenons? Do we do a tenectomy or not? And ensuring the implant is free and mobile and not caught in tenons. And that's typically what I advocate, is to really make sure that we're not stuck or caught in tenons wherever we place these devices. The Zen has undergone many different approaches here. starting off with ab internal closed, as well as ab internal open conjunctiva. And these open conjunctival approaches, I think, just allow the surgeon to provide more precision with where the implant is placed, and many surgeons have moved more toward this to help. Primary needling has also been something that's been performed more to really ensure the implant is free of tenons. And this is an example of a PreserFlow device, which has been placed ab external open conjunctiva for really precise placement. Many people argue, well, if we're opening the conjunctiva, why not just do a trabeculectomy? But the benefit of hypotony protection and the benefit of improved postoperative pressure stability is a benefit here, and better blood morphology with the posterior drainage. This is an example of patients in the first few months after surgery, trabeculectomy on the left, Zen gel stent in the middle, and PreserFlow microstent on the right. See the significant difference in these almost 200 patients in each group in the postoperative IOP variability. Much more variability in trabeculectomy, less so in Zen, and even less so in PreserFlow, previously known as InFocus. This is a real advantage in that early postoperative period in recovery. And also, we've shown as well an improved visual recovery, both total visual recovery, as well as the rapidity of the rapid nature and the speed at which the vision recovers is improved when we use microshunting and microstenting approaches to trabeculectomy. And that's really what the value of microinvasive bleb surgery or MIB surgery is. We still get good power, less postoperative intensity, and of course, it is still a bleb, however. We still use mitomycin, and there still are potential bleb complications. But by standardizing the lumen size, we can really improve the hypotony risk by still applying significant wound healing modulation like mitomycin C. Our blebs are typically more posterior, and I think this is a better bleb position for safety and comfort as well. And really reduced postoperative intensity and recovery, much smoother profile, and more patient-friendly. Of course, as usual, selection is important as well, and we still debate whether we can truly get down to trabeculectomy levels, although many of us have shown that with improved techniques and the use of mitomycin. So today's glaucoma surgical options can be divided up between Schenck's canal outflow procedures available today and subconjunctival outflow procedures. In the Schenck's canal space, we basically talk about MIGS procedures we've discussed earlier, and the subconj outflow we can divide up between MIBS procedures, trabeculectomy, and traditional tube shunts. Now, how do we select these procedures? This is a real balance between safety and efficacy. It's a bit of a tug of war. We know the high degree of safety, but we still want more efficacy often with canal procedures. Subconj procedures have a high degree of efficacy, but we do have some safety concerns early and long term as well. I think in glaucoma, like many other medical entities, we think about doing a stepwise approach where we choose lower risk but maybe lower potency options and escalate as needed to more higher risk, high potency options as well. In terms of choosing the right surgical procedures, these are some of the questions I like to ask. Is my patient going to cataract surgery? Some procedures are more amenable to doing glaucoma procedures with cataract and has been studied more in this population. Is the pressure controlled or not? We'll talk about this shortly. How severe is the glaucoma? And this ties into what's the target pressure. How tolerable and how adherent are medications to our patient? And how old is my patient? What's the horizon I need for pressure lowering over the long run in terms of the risks I take to get there? When we look at this chart, we have pressure lowering on the y-axis, risk level on the right. Of course, medications and lasers, the bottom left, there are reasonable pressure lowering. Not as much, though, as we see with filtering procedures, but low risk. On the other hand, on the top right, we have very aggressive procedures that lower pressure, great, but have a high degree of risk. And of course, our ideal place to have a procedure that may be new is very, very low risk, but very, very high pressure lowering. Well, that doesn't exist, but I think we can place trabecular meshwork mixed procedures and MIS procedures in these categories where we're kind of encroaching more toward the top left of this graph. Still have some ways to go, but it gives us more options to patients. I look at 4 different buckets of patients when we think about selection of these procedures. Combination cataract, standalone patients, whether they need target of mid to high teens, 12, or single digits. One of the most common questions I ask when patients are in my examination room is the patient controlled? By controlled glaucoma, what I mean is their peak pressure is at or below target, typically based on severity and life expectancy. Stability of visual field and OCT over 2 years ideally could be shown. Is the patient adherent? And are they tolerating therapy? And if they're not controlled, the question is what's next? And we have lasers, we have more medications, we have potential drug delivery, bleb surgery, and trabecular meshwork mixed procedures as we discussed. And remember again, the different levels of pressure lowering that we've spoken about. So when my patient needs a pressure in the mid-teens and or the goal is less drops, when patients have issues with topical glaucoma therapy, whether it's adherence or quality of life, we want to address these proactively. We know that these can result in pressure fluctuations and lack of adherence and progression. I think mixed procedures really are well placed for this. And these are patients and procedures that are designed to replace medications or be considered as a surgical procedure when a bleb is not needed, yet at least. And particular patients that I think do well for this are patients who have combination phaco glaucoma procedures. They synergistically work well with phaco. Bleb procedures don't work as well with cataract surgery, and they're antagonistic in some ways. And one can stage a glaucoma filtering procedure later on if need be. The patient who's young, uncontrolled juvenile glaucoma can do well. We know that angle procedures and canal procedures work quite well in congenital glaucoma. Well, pediatric and juvenile glaucoma, I'm talking about, for example, even 40, 50-year-olds, I think have a spectrum of that congenital type of glaucoma there that can do well with these procedures, primarily addressing trabecular meshwork. The uveitic glaucoma patients, I think, can particularly do well. And older patients who have mild to moderate disease with compliance issues as well are patients we consider mixed procedures. Now, when a patient needs lower pressure, 12 or lower, in that low teen range, I think bleb surgery is really the option that we go for these patients. And we can really debate filtering surgery versus MIBS versus MIGS and what's the goal of surgery. Trabeculectomy remains the gold standard. Absolutely. We can titrate downwards, early postoperative laser lysis to get that low pressure, although we take some risk and there's some variability in those responses. MIGS are less potent, but really provide an excellent non-bleb and safer option for certain patients we've discussed, and particularly with combination cataract, they combine synergistically and they don't impact typically future filtering surgery in this manner. And MIGS procedures are similar efficacy, maybe less potent than trabeculectomy, but again, because of the predictability, more control, I think have a less and reduced postoperative intensity, and bleb morphology are an option for a bleb procedure as a first bleb procedure to do on a patient as needed. Well, algorithms are always consideration. These are some of my notes I jotted down when I think about what do I choose when. Some of the procedure attributes I have, again, are safety, efficacy, postoperative management intensity, ease of use, speed of recovery, and of course, cost reimbursement are very important. The context is important as well, as I said before. Whether we're combining with cataract surgery or standalone, this is important when we think about it. When we do combination cataract surgery, safety is paramount. Recovery is paramount. That's the primary reason we're doing surgery. We want to really maximize the benefit of cataract surgery. When we're going in on our own just for glaucoma surgery, though, although safety is important, we have to have enough pressure lowering sufficiently. Again, let's get back to these 4 buckets I talked about earlier. Combination cataract patients, I want to really avoid a combination cataract bleb for reasons I mentioned. Blebs don't work as well, and of course, they're antagonistic with the fast recovery of a cataract patient and the refractive improvement we get. We want to choose the safest, least impactful procedure to the cataract surgery recovery and have excellent synergy with these procedures. And this is where SEMS canal stenting, I think, works very well for these patients. What about my patients who standalone target or patients who need more mid-high teens? Well, I want to avoid a bleb here. I want to get the greatest probability of pressure lowering amongst the options we have in the angle procedures and the greatest access to electric channels. And this is where ab interno trabeculotomy, I think, has a good role to really address these patients with these targets. What about patients who need more low teens, pressure 12 in that range? We typically need a bleb for these patients for adequate pressure lowering. We want something predictable, less invasive, and a faster recovery than traditional approaches with improved bleb morphology. This is where that MIBS procedures, I think, can play in the space here to get those patients to that level in a safer way. And of course, for patients who really need standalone targets of single digits or have had other procedures already, I think most patients don't need this level of pressure lowering, but some people do, of course. We've got to take the risk to get there, and this is where trabeculectomy really needs to be considered. So as far as an algorithmic approach, thinking about where we are with interventional glaucoma, I think we are moving toward lower targets for patients at risk, which are a lot of patients, particularly younger patients with mild to moderate glaucoma, even over the long run are at risk here. SLT, I think, addresses some of the issues on compliance and pressure fluctuation, so it's a first-line option. We want to escalate as we need to with power if patients progress, moving to surgery earlier, particularly, again, when we're doing cataract surgery, combining with MIGS or standalone for certain patients. We've seen improved subcon surgery with MIBS. That should be considered earlier than we do for trabeculectomy. Trabs are still needed, and cycloablation is still evolving. I think one of the most important things we've seen, though, in the interventional glaucoma era and the MIGS mindset is the surgeon's mentality. We're seeing really a change in the skill set of a glaucoma specialist and even comprehensive ophthalmologists treating glaucoma to develop the mindset of an interventional approach, being proactive in disease, addressing adherence, do it safer, and with good efficacy for the patient that needs that target pressure. And so I hope we continue to evolve in these areas and continue to develop better approaches and improve maximizing and understanding where MIGS goes. I hope this has been helpful to just better understand maybe and classify, understand patient selection of where MIGS procedures fit, where MIGS procedures fit, the differences between them, and patient selection and considerations around that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Ahmed. He's now here with us live to answer your questions. Thank you for that wonderful talk, quite comprehensive and revealing. We have one question here that's been submitted. What's your opinion on combo microgoniotomy with an eye stent or hydrus?
Yeah, hey, thanks so much for the kind invitation. I apologize. I have a few multiple personal conflicts tonight. My son's graduation was moved to today, so I had to join the family, but thanks so much. So it's a good question. I think we're still evaluating, the benefits of adding, ab-intermittent trabeculotomy or microgoniotomy to stenting. As I said, my personal thoughts are that I think there's some benefit, of course, in opening up a larger degree of the angle. And I often combine this with some viscodilation to try to address the distal outflow. And stenting perhaps provides a more durable patency within the proximal outflow system. So I like to do a combination. I'll use an eye stent and I'll do a bit of a goniotomy before I place it, for example, or I'll do the same thing with a hydrus, or I'll do a blade to do an otomy. So, this happens typically with most surgeries. You start to modify and adjust as you want to get more out of them. And although we've proven good safety with MIGS, I think we're still looking to get more efficacy. And that's why many of us are moving toward cutting procedures, combining them with stenting. We still have more to go. We still have a lot more comparative research to have to really guide, the right kind of selection of procedures.
That's wonderful. In your discussion of MIGS, you mentioned that minimizing the risk of post-op hyphema is important. Do you have any additional comments on what specifically you would address?
Yeah, I think, hyphema formation, we've seen in our studies that this can certainly lead to IOP spikes and the risk of synechial formation. So we really try to address that, by ensuring that we, pressurize that at the end of the case. We, ensure that try to reduce the risk of bleeding by holding back anticoagulants if you're doing a larger goniotomy or trabeculotomy. And, that I think can help. Other factors, it sometimes does take some time for the trabecular meshwork in the canal to reestablish outflow. So a bit of time helps. Interestingly enough, many of us are using pilocarpine when we're doing cutting procedures, and pilocarpine may help to not only reduce the risk of synechial formation, but actually to pull on the scleral spur. By pulling on the scleral spur, this can sort of open up those leaflets that we've cut, for example, with the cutting procedures. So, those are some of the things that we do. But otherwise, for the most part, MIGS is pretty low intensity in terms of post-operative management, especially stenting. It's really fairly straightforward. Some of us debate, do we stop the medications cold turkey? Do we continue some of them and taper them off? It probably depends more on how many medications are being used pre-op. But patients on 1 or 2 medications, I typically stop the glaucoma medications. If they're on 3 or 4, I usually keep 1 or 2 on board, depending on severity. And the last thing I'll mention is steroids. I mean, steroids are needed, they're important. But these patients are prone to steroid response. They have glaucoma, and although we open the canal, they still seem to show a response in 1 to 3 weeks. So something that, we have to just watch for in the first few weeks, and sometimes we have to add back meds. So yeah, glaucoma is not so simple, but we're trying to, address ways that the different eyes heal. Sorry for the noise here.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we appreciate that you changed your schedule around to make yourself available to us, and congratulations on your child's graduation. So let's go ahead to our next speaker, who's Dr. Dollywall. Dr. Dollywall has been with us in the past and enjoyed her talks. She's professor of ophthalmology at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. She holds several directorships, including director of refractive surgery, director of the cornea service, director of the UPMC Laser Vision Center, and she's associate medical director of the Campbell Ophthalmic Microbiology Laboratory and is the co-director of the Corneal Stem Cell Task Force. She's vice chair for communication and wellness at UPMC Department of Ophthalmology. Today, Dr. Dollywall is going to share with us her insights in the evaluation and management of the dry eye patient in her talk titled Demystifying Dry Eye. Dr. Dollywall, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Ed. It's so wonderful to see you. And I just want to thank all my friends in Connecticut and New York, especially Debbie Osborne, who is really kind of a fearless leader in bringing together ophthalmology and helping us to learn and also remember what's really important. So that lecture with Rabbi Berger was incredible and I think so much needed. So thank you for inviting me to come back, and thank you to Dr. DeLuise as well for this honor. So today I am going to tackle a topic that I deal with every day, and that is dry eye. Now, we have dry eye patients all over the place, right? Doesn't matter which specialty you are in, guarantee you will see dry eye patients sprinkled into your schedule. So what I'd like to do in the next half hour is really demystify dry eye. I want to give you some really great pearls that I've learned over the past 27 years of doing cornea at the University of Pittsburgh, and just to make it easy, make it simple, straightforward, so you can really kind of get in there, help the patients, and then continue to move forward. So let's get started. So here are my financial disclosures, and I do consult with several dry eye companies. And since Deb Osborne and the Connecticut Society of Eye Physicians are giving us this gift of free education, I wanted to pay it forward, and I'd like to give all of you a gift. And this is a gift of this incredible webinar series that the Cornea Society has put together, which is called Reimagining Dry Eye. And this was put together with a gift from Oyster Point Pharmaceuticals. And it has amazing speakers. So we have Reza Dana, Kaz Sobota, Stephen Flugfelder, and Sarah Ham Alvarez. And we've been doing these webinars, and you can listen to the recorded ones, and you can attend one more left on June 22nd. And this is free for everybody. And this is really a deep dive into dry eye. So we start with a lecture from one of our, world's experts in dry eye, looking at the pathophysiology, and then carrying it forward with some cases and panels. So to access this, you go to corneasociety.org, you go to meetings and events, and then you'll see Reimagining Dry Eye. And then here it is, a free 4-part webinar series. You register, and then you can click that register button and go ahead and register, and you'll be able to access this amazing content. So I obviously cannot go through all of the pathophysiology and all this in a half an hour. So you can just watch that and you'll know everything. I want to really tailor this talk to clinical pearls you can use. Here's also a QR code for registration to make life easy. If you want to just click on that QR code, you can do that. Okay, now let's get down to business. Dry eye definition. This is important because really, if we understand what dry eye is, we can help our patients. So it's a multifactorial disease characterized by persistently unstable and or deficient tear film. Okay, so it doesn't have to be missing, it just is unstable, causing discomfort and or visual impairment. So a patient's main symptom might be fluctuating vision, and that's their dry eye. So it doesn't have to be just pain and foreign body sensation. And these issues are accompanied by variable degrees of ocular surface epitheliopathy, inflammation, and neurosensory abnormalities. And this definition really stems from this really great article, which is a review paper defining dry eye from a clinical perspective. And again, I'd highly recommend this reading. And this is actually what the 4-part webinar series is based on. So it's a lot of great content. Why do we care? Why should we bother? Well, Ike Ahmed just talked about all these glaucoma drops that we're trying to get patients off of because they're toxic. We see so much toxicity. If we don't deal with dry eye disease, ocular surface toxicity, it's going to affect patients' vision. It's going to affect preoperative measurements when trying to do cataract surgery or any type of surgery, and postoperative healing. So you really want to pay attention to everybody's ocular surface. And, you might say, oh, yeah. I've been doing this for years. It's okay. Well, you'll get away with it most of the time, but sometimes you're not. You're going to get in trouble. And I'll show you some slides of that. But if you don't optimize preoperatively, you can have the wrong IOL or a corneal disaster like the following. So this is a corneal melt. This is a patient with Sjogren's syndrome who just started developing this ulcer, totally asymptomatic, and was, at least 80% thinned when she presented, completely asymptomatic, just routine cataract surgery. And another patient, very sad case, monocular patient, HSV reactivation, corneal perforation after cataract surgery. And she had to have a PKP and a tarsorrhaphy just because her ocular surface was not optimized. This patient had a corneal perforation after cataract surgery, uncomplicated cataract surgery, because she had atopic dermatitis with atopic keratoconjunctivitis. So now I have your attention, right? This is a big deal. So how are we going to deal with it? Well, we have to really evaluate these patients properly. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Got to do a good history, testing, exam, figure out a treatment plan, and then have a discussion with the patient. So here's my top pearl right now. Never ask an open-ended question like, what seems to be the problem? If you go into a room of a dry eye patient and say that, you'll basically not be able to get a word in edgewise for 45 minutes. So now what I do is I go in and I say, what are the top 2 or 3 things that bother you about your eyes or vision? And I just stop and I let them speak. So they only get 2 or 3 things, depending on how far behind you are in your schedule. And they actually have to enumerate this. So patients say, well, I have dry eye. I say, okay, but what does that mean? What is actually bothering you? And it's interesting what you'll find. Sometimes people say, well, I have blurred vision. That's what's bothering me, or the fluctuating vision. Or maybe patients will say, oh, really, it's just itchy. So they think it's dry eye, but maybe it's really allergy. So you have to ask them this question, because when they state these 2 or 3 things, then you have clear things that you can treat. You have these 3 things that you're going to focus on. So then I ask, does anything make your symptoms better, even for a split second? And if they say no, they've tried everything, nothing helps, then I'll just put a little drop of artificial tear in. And I'll say, how about that? Did that help? And if they say that didn't help even for a split second, then I'll put a drop of proparacaine in. If there's still no improvement, then I'm thinking about a patient with neuropathic pain. And then we would send them to pain clinic for medication treatment, such as gabapentin, et cetera, because this is something, if it can't improve with proparacaine, where I'm numbing the ocular surface, then typically my strategies are not going to be impactful. So that's just a quick way to assess if you can help these patients. And here are some more really important questions. You have to ask, are symptoms worse in the morning or later in the day? If symptoms are worse in the morning, there's 3 things you're going to think about: floppy eyelids, blepharitis, or lag of thalamus. And then you always ask if they sleep under a fan, very, very common, the weather's getting warmer, or they have a CPAP that might be a little leaky. And if that's the case, then night goggles might be helpful. If their dry eye or their symptoms are worse later in the day, then you're going to think about classic dry eye. More important questions. I always ask patients, what is your sleep position? Because I see a lot of patients with floppy eyelids, so that, they'll often just be sleeping on the side that they're more bothered with. And then I ask, how much do you rub your eyes? Because it turns out almost everybody is an eye rubber, whether they admit it or not. Then I'll say, show me. So this is a patient, one of my patients, she came in, I was the 5th person she saw for severe dry eye. That was what she was coming in for. Then I started talking to her and I said, do you rub your eyes? She said, yeah, sometimes. I said, show me. So here she goes. Okay, go. So this is how you rub your eyes. You kind of get up underneath there. Okay. And how often do you do that?
A lot.
Okay, like every hour.
Especially I think when I.
Yeah. Okay. So now you can see why she has chronic irritation. She literally is rubbing her superior tarsus with her thumb. And she does this a lot. So of course we had a lot of discussion about behavior modification. And by seeing what she was doing, I could understand what she needed. And it was a different therapy. So let's talk about more history questions. Systemic medications. Many of these have dry eye as side effects, like antidepressants, beta blockers, birth control pills, diuretics, antipsychotics, Accutane use, huge one. And of course, Dupixent. So over-the-counter meds, remember to always ask about this also, because people don't think Zyrtec is a medication, right? They just think it's OTC. So antihistamines increase dryness by 120%. Remember to ask about previous medication use, okay? So some people will forget that they took Accutane when they were a teenager, but that will have permanent side effects, especially affecting the meibomian glands. Also, previous chemotherapy. So that can have long-lasting effects. Remember also to ask about previous surgery. So the blepharoplasty, which might have been a little aggressive, and now patients have incomplete blink. They just cannot close their eyes. Or previous refractive surgery can definitely be an issue in patients with dry eye. So we did our history. Now let's get to testing. Now, this does not have to be complicated. There's wonderful testing, point of care testing, tear osmolarity, MMP9, but guess what? You don't have to have that to diagnose dry eye. It's a great tool, but don't feel like, you can't be effective if you don't have it. The other thing is a Zone Quick or a Schirmer test. This is to assess the tear volume. It's okay if you don't do this. If you have it, it's just another data point, but it's not mandatory. A Zone Quick is a phenol red thread test, and that just takes 15 seconds. So we often do this for our refractive patients just to see how much wetting they have, because a Schirmer test is really quite uncomfortable for patients. Now, when you're seeing these, kind of patients who have been really afflicted and bothered, don't forget to check corneal sensation. So that is really important. We're seeing a lot of neurotrophic keratitis and keratopathy, and you can only really understand that if you check sensation. So systemic workup is important because in certain patient population, because the eyes are an extension of the rest of the body. So you have to rule out systemic diseases that are commonly associated with dry eye, such as Sjogren's, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. So I always ask about dry mouth. So if they have dry eye, dry mouth, I'm really suspicious about Sjogren's especially. Topography is helpful. And again, not mandatory, but it's very, very helpful. And so this patient had very irregular topography. And I thought, she definitely had dry eye, but I said, that's really irregular. Don't forget to flip the lid. She actually had a chalazion under her lid that was causing flattening of her cornea. So what we did is treat her dry eye, remove the chalazion, and her topography improved. So always remember to look externally as well in the eyes. Speaking of external, this is what I do when I walk into any patient's room. I do an external eye exam. Left and right. Okay, that takes 9 seconds. Please, 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 another key pearl. Do this on all your patients. Look down. Look at those floppy eyelids. And right. Yeah. So just do that. You'll get an assessment of what's going on in their eyes. And that is really, really helpful. So when you walk into the room, look at the blink rate of the patient, look at how much they're closing their eyes. Parkinson's patients, we've diagnosed Parkinson's disease in some of our patients who came in for a dry eye evaluation. They didn't even know they had Parkinson's, but we saw they just didn't blink. They had that stare. And that external eye exam will also show you if they have hyperemia, et cetera. So when you pull the lower lids down and have the patient look up, if the hyperemia is involving their bulbar and tarsal conj, it's conjunctivitis. Okay, it is definitely conjunctivitis. There you go. You just made the diagnosis. This is actually my son, and he has horrible allergic conjunctivitis. So it's bilateral, and it's definitely seasonal. So he is taking some antihistamines now, topically and orally. The one thing that I will remind you guys of is this condition called mucus fishing syndrome. Typically, it's chronic conjunctivitis in one eye, and that's repeated mechanical irritation. And this is something that I see very commonly because it's kind of a masquerader for dry eye. And what you'll notice is you'll see some stringy mucus in the lower fornix. And then you ask the patient, boy, that must be really irritating. How do you remove that? And sometimes it's shocking what you'll hear. So a lot of patients, like they kind of, put their finger up into their fornix to get the mucus out, although they'll take a hanky and, just kind of really get in there. They are really bothered by this. So they do a lot of measures to get the mucus out. And this is definitely another behavioral modification, education situation. So you have to really just take your time and educate these patients. Otherwise, they don't stop. So if the hyperemia is limited to the bulbar conj, think episcleritis or scleritis. And then again, you saw when you have the patient look down and pull the lids up, floppy lid syndrome, huge, huge, huge. We see this very, very commonly. And these patients have dry eye, but they also have mechanical irritation because their lids are everting at night. So they get the morning irritation. So what we do for these patients is have them wear an eye shield at night, have them switch sleep positions, always ask about sleep apnea in this patient population. There's a huge overlap, and also be suspicious for keratoconus, another huge overlap with floppy eyelid syndrome. And when you lift the lid, one dry eye associated disease is superior limbic keratoconjunctivitis, which is more of a mechanical friction of the superior conj with the upper lid. And that treatment is some dry eye therapy, but also aggressive. You could do conj cautery right there to kind of spot weld the conj, and that can be very helpful. And that's associated with dry eye disease and sicca, K-sicca. So I cannot practice without a fluorescein strip. So now we're finally getting to the slit lamp exam. Okay, we've done our history, our testing, and now we're finally at the slit lamp. And all I need is a fluorescein strip and a slit lamp. That's it for the exam. So I use a strip, and what I do is I wet it with a little BSS, and I'll show you exactly what I do here. And I just wet the strip. I took this video this morning, and I basically just shake off the little bit of BSS there, and I just tap it to the lower lid. And then they blink, 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 and I assess their tear film. So it's really, really easy. Tear film breakup time is a critical thing to understand when you're looking at blinks, okay? And Kaz Svoboda showed some wonderful videos of tear film breakup time and kind of different types of dry eye and all looking at that. So you really want to look at how the tear film is spread, where is it staining on the cornea, and how things look. So that's very, very helpful. And lissamine green can be used for conjunctival staining. So remember, when you put the fluorescein strip in, you can have a normal cornea on a slit, which looks like this when you look with the diffuse blue light. So again, critically important to really look at the whole picture of the cornea. So this is obviously basement membrane dystrophy, but when I'm talking about tear film breakup time, it's when you have the patient open their eyelid and just watch the tear film, you'll see in a patient who has deficient lipid layer that the tear film is breaking up. It's just not able to stay smooth and kind of cohesive in between blinks. The next thing I do is I press on their lower lid margin. I'm assessing the degree of meibomian gland inspissation. And I tell patients, your glands should have olive oil coming out of them. And, obviously this looks more like Crisco. So they get that analogy. Then don't forget to have the patient look down. So here's where you're going to see the Demodex. And Demodex is extremely common. This is actually a mite. And that's what it looks like in high mag. And this is, the sleeves are actually these mites in this hair follicle. And another thing that we're really paying attention to is lash position. So we see lash ptosis is been described with keratoconus when there's pressure kind of down on the pillow or on their face. But we see lash displacement. And what we see is patients who sleep with pressure on their eye will have their lashes turning nasally. And so here are two patients of mine where their lashes are turning nasally, and that's the side they sleep on. And that's the side that's more irritated. So when you're at the slit lamp, you're going to watch the blink more closely and see if it's complete or incomplete. And you can see lid imbrication here. Always avert the upper lid. Also, some patients just have chronic concretions, and you can help patients by removing that. Okay, so now we're to the treatment, and you're going to basically target the treatment based on the history and exam findings. So if it's EBMD, that's simple. You can do a superficial keratectomy and wait for that cornea to stabilize, and then you'll have a new set of Ks. But remember, don't do the superficial keratectomy until you optimize the ocular surface first. How are you going to do that? Well, if there's inflammation of the lids and a low tear volume, then we'll do artificial tears on a schedule like QID. I never allow patients to use artificial tears every hour because they basically wash away their natural mucins, and it actually causes them to have more discomfort. I love anti-inflammatories. So we'll use topical mild steroids to initiate therapy, and they can use it as a pulse. And they're always on some type of ocular, anti-inflammatory. So lifitegrast or cyclosporin A. And I think nasal varenicline is also wonderful. And that just helps improve and have patients make more tears. I like to reserve punctal plugs for a return visit after the ocular surface inflammation has improved. And then punctal cautery is just really wonderful if there's severe aqueous deficiency. If patients, go through this and they're still having symptoms, then we'll go to autologous serum or PRP. And then if it's meibomian gland disease, then we're going to do some warm compresses, lid massage. And we have wonderful tools to do this. And there's microwave options, electric options, in-office treatments. They're all incredibly effective. We definitely do want them to be on something systemic as well. So oral omega-3s or a gamma-linoleic acid product. I really don't love doxycycline as much as I used to because it affects the microbiome. So I'm trying to stay away from that unless it's a melting ulcer or severe ocular surface disease. And I just use it for a brief time, not forever. So that's important. Now for the Demodex, we have them use tea tree oil wipes and then ointment, a bland ointment to the base of their lashes at night. And I think education is very, very important. The ointment to the base of the lashes basically smothers the mites. They have allergy. I like to treat allergy locally as much as possible versus systemically. So eye drops, nasal spray, inhaler, as opposed to systemic antihistamines because that dries the eye so much. And if they need that, then we would ask them to use Singulair, which is an anti-leukotriene instead of an antihistamine, which has the ocular drying effects. Now, if they have lagophthalmos, poor blink, you got to do this think blink education. Blinking is so important. It helps the meibomian glands express the oils. Moisture goggles are wonderful. Avoid the drafts, avoid the ceiling fans, and don't forget lateral tarsorrhaphy in severe patients or scleral contact lenses. And we have a whole list of homework that we give our patients so that we just check the boxes of what they need. And that's how we do it. So in conclusion, I think that dry eye patients deserve to be heard and treated appropriately. Taking a stepwise approach to these patients is extremely helpful and very important. A targeted history and careful slit lamp exam is really all you need to make a diagnosis and formulate treatment strategies. So you don't need like a million different diagnostic devices. If you just have a fluorescein strip and a slit lamp, you can do this. Remember to optimize the ocular surface prior to cataract or refractive surgery. And remember, it's better to delay surgery and avoid a post-op disaster. Okay. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to invite you all to visit us next year when we're going to open our new Vision Institute in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Dr. Dollywall. Excellent talk. Not only can I not get the picture of that woman grabbing her tarsal plates and rubbing it out of my mind, but you actually have a question on that. How did you help that patient who rubbed her upper tarsus? Did she ever stop rubbing?
Oh, that's such a great question. So we have behavior modification as one of our, really kind of treatment pathways. And we spend a lot of time with education. So, we talk to them, what is your stimulus for eye rubbing? Are you rubbing because it feels good or because your eye itches? So if they're itching because of allergy, then we treat the allergy. We try to, we ask them to see an allergist, figure out what they're allergic to. If they're rubbing because it feels good, then, sometimes they need to work with behavior modification therapy. And so, yes, she's better. She actually is better. So we actually have her wear a shield at night so she doesn't rub it because she sleeps on that side also. But it was just making the diagnosis. Like she really had been bothered with this for years. And so it was just the fact that she knew that she could get better. We empower our patients. Oftentimes we say, you are going to heal yourself. We're going to just, give you some ideas and some tools to help you do that. But ultimately, you are the one that's going to make a difference. So we really want to empower our patients to feel like they're in charge. I don't like patients to think I'm curing them. They are curing themselves. And when they have that ownership in their medical care and we say, look, this is on you. This is your homework. You do your homework, you'll get a good grade, you're going to feel better, and it's going to be a happy day when you come back. If you don't, then, then it's on you.
That's so true for so many of our treatments that we put on our patients. We have another question. Are gel drops more helpful than regular tears?
And that's another very good question. So gel drops can be, but it's very personal. So I have patients just, if I have some samples, I'll give them samples of everything. Gel drops typically last longer, but it can also cause blurring of their vision. So some patients are extremely bothered by blur. So they don't want that even though their eyes are dry. So what we do is we layer therapy. So we always start with an anti-inflammatory and then we'll layer the therapy on top of that. So I might use more of a gel drop, if somebody's not driving, et cetera. And again, just closing your eyes and just like blinking when they're on the phone and that type of thing can rehydrate and is very helpful. And sometimes I even have them use Gentile gel if, they're bad.
Wonderful. You generated quite a bit of interest in your topic. I was hoping that maybe you could spend some time answering the questions that are in the question box or on the chat box, because we're going to need to move on to the next part of our program. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Our next speakers are Zaina Al-Mutaseb and Kathleen McCabe. Dr. Al-Mutaseb is an associate professor at the Baylor College of Medicine and serves as associate residency director. She is a researcher, educator, author, and lecturer. Dr. McCabe is the chief medical officer at Eye Health America. On the governing board of ASCRS, she holds numerous leadership and advisory positions and is an active physician mentor to our next generation of ophthalmologists. Dr. Al-Mutaseb and Dr. McCabe are going to speak on IOL surgery in complex circumstances, such as absence of capsular support, fixation of IOLs, and cataract surgery in the presence of corneal scars in their talk titled Complicated Cataract Surgery and IOL Exchange and Secondary IOLs. Dr. Al-Motaseb and Dr. McCabe, welcome.
Thank you so much, and I'm pretty impressed with how well you said my name there.
I won't tell you how much I practiced.
Okay, so if you give me the opportunity to share my screen.
I'm delighted to be here with you and with Zaina, and I'm delighted to be with the audience. This is really fun for me. You know, Dr. Al-Motaseb is one of the amazing surgeons that I have the pleasure to know as a dear colleague and friend. And it's so fun to share our approaches to how we deal with these complicated cases that we all see.
Yeah, no, and I want to, I'm so excited when you asked me and Dr. McCabe. I was really excited because I think she's one of the best surgeons out there in the country to talk about these complicated cases. Actually, before we start, you should tell us where you are. It's amazing that we can still Zoom in and do these talks, because I'm personally sick and I wouldn't have been able to do this if it was live. And tell us, Kathy, where you're at right now.
Well, actually, this is our week of our mission trip that we haven't attended for 2 years because of the pandemic. And so 3 years gone, there's a lot of need here. So I'm in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I am delighted that I can join all of you. And also I have some of my colleagues here in St. Vincent who are attending as well. So it's a lot of fun.
Awesome. So let's jump right into the talk. Here,
that's St. Vincent, by the way. That's Young Island right there, and our mission.
And these are our financial disclosures. Together, we cover a lot, but none of which are really relevant to this talk. It doesn't pay to do these complex cases, that's for sure. We published this back in 2017 about IOL fixation and absence of capsular support. All of my colleagues at Baylor looking at sclerofixation versus ACIOL versus iris fixation and then scleral sutured IOLs in the old way that we did the method at that time. And what we saw was pretty equal refractive outcomes. And there were different concepts in terms of the complications, but in general, it was all the same. And since 2017, things have changed significantly. So that's really what we're going to concentrate on. And Kathy, maybe you can talk us about when we can still use iris fixation.
Yeah, so, I love the technique of iris fixation as kind of a fail-safe. It's my fastball. It works with all these 3 lenses that we have. And if you look, this is the technique I generally use, which is called the double needle technique. It was published by John Hart, and it really does a great job of allowing you to get your bites through the iris and those sutures peripheral enough that you don't get deformation and ovalization of the pupil. So what you do is you take this double-armed tenoproline suture and you place it, once the optic is captured in front of the iris, you take the most peripheral bite you can through the iris and under the haptic, and then it allows you to stabilize the iris while you pass that more peripheral suture. And then there are many different techniques for externalizing the suture after that. You can either do it directly through a paracentesis right there. You can use modified mechanical suture. You can do it intraocularly with intraocular forceps. Whatever suits your fancy and you feel most comfortable with, they all work well. I've used them all. So what about you, Zaina? What do you do with iris?
Yeah, I think your technique of how to do it was how I used to do it. When we looked at our sort of outcomes, we had a little bit higher rates of cystoid macular edema. And now with the newer techniques, I rarely do iris fixation, but I agree with you. Sometimes if you want to avoid a vitrectomy and the lens is sort of dislocated right then and there, this is a great technique, especially if there's a little bit of capsule remnant so that you can avoid some of the pseudophacodenesis. And I think that's probably what was causing some of our higher rates of CME. But a lot of different surgeons are still do it and have really great, much lower rates. So for me, I don't use it as much anymore, but this is exactly how I used to do the technique.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. I don't want to give the impression that this is my go-to, but as we're going to talk about in detail, you always want to have your approach A, B, C, and D, 1, 2, 3, 4, And all of those plans kind of laid out in advance. And somewhere in that series of plans, I'll have iris fixation. It'll be 2, 3, or 4, but it'll be there.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's why I really like scleral fixation. And these are some of the points of why. I think it really affects the cornea minimally in terms of the angle too. And it really approximates sort of the actual position of the crystalline lens. Issues such as contact with the iris is why I believe we have a lot less CME and UG syndrome. But of course, it used to be very difficult to do scleral fixation. You can see from one of the videos up there, if you're doing a lot of sclerotomies or basically a 6 millimeter opening for the CZ70BD, which was my go-to lens with Gore-Tex suture, you can have significant bleeding. This is an area that's definitely very, very vascular. You can have lens tilt, even the areas of needle penetration. And then you can have issues with Gore-Tex suture showing up a little bit later too, and coming outside the wound. So all of these reasons, I think, we hesitated on doing scleral fixation, and that's why I think we used to do a little bit more iris sutured. But now there's new techniques of doing it. Can you talk to us a little bit about the acreose suture fixation here?
Absolutely. So, I think one of the nice things about having 4 closed loops on the IOL, like the acreose does, is that it gives you this very, very stable fixation, and really centration's not very difficult either. And centration and tilt can be issues even with more advanced techniques we're going to talk about. And I know Zaina's going to give us some really good pearls on how to avoid that. But what you see here is that I am using sclerotomies that are 2 millimeters posterior to limbus and about 4 to 5 millimeters apart. And I have placed a Gore-Tex suture cut piece through those closed loop haptics of the acreose lens. And then I externalize those through the sclerotomies. The trailing ones, I can place it in there through a small incision because I don't have to worry about placing these trailing haptics, the Gore-Tex through that. I will do that intraocularly, as you can see here, just using a microforceps. And everything's very controlled, very slow, very stable. I'm not really having to stress and worry about this lens falling in the back. It's already supported by the first 2 closed loop haptics with Gore-Tex suture that's externalized through those other sclerotomies. I've made 2 additional sclerotomies 180 degrees apart. And now you can see I'm placing a microforceps through one of those, again, 2 millimeters posterior to the limbus, about 4 millimeters apart. And I'm grabbing one of the cut ends through that. And now the second sclerotomy, again, with microforceps, which are one of the tools you just have to have, a good set of micro instruments. And with sort of a hand over hand technique, one hand grabbing the Gore-Tex and the other then externalizing it through that sclerotomy on this side. And once both sutures have been externalized on either side, 180 degrees apart, it's a simple process to tighten those up. They don't have to be terribly tight. You just want it supporting the lens and centered. The really important thing, as Zaina already alluded to, is making sure you make these small knots that are buried well within the sclerotomy so that there's no chance of that knot later eroding through sclera, because that can happen. And now what do you do if it happens? Well, you can make a little peritomy there or a little opening within conjunctiva and then just reposit it within a sclerotomy so that it's not up and exposed and eroding through conjunctiva.
Yep, I agree completely with you. I've had a couple sent over erosions, and I've tried corneal patch grafts, scleral patch grafts, and it erodes through all of that. So you actually have to rotate it completely through the sclera or cut it, remove it, and start over. It really can erode through everything. So beautiful video. And I similarly did the same kind of technique, but with the CZ70BD. And the other thing that you did beautifully is using the 25 gauge max forceps or whatever micro forceps you have, and doing it to avoid sort of the spaghetti and having everything all together entangled. So it's really important to feed each other and do one at a time and make sure that you have it correct. So tell us about this next case.
All right, so what you see here is a patient. She was thrown a set of keys 5 months earlier, hit her in the eye. and developed some poor vision in that eye. And you see the femtosecond laser on the video to the right. And I'm looking at the distance between the intercapsular. If we can go back just to that slide for a second, looking at the intercapsule touching the right side, as you can see in the middle picture on the lower image, right side of the iris, there's a big gap on the other side between the iris right there, absolutely. And this just extreme lens tilt. So I could see already that the margin of the cataract was visible and scalloped. Those are always bad signs for a large area of zonular dialysis, but this proved to me that, yeah, we're in for a more challenging case. I like using the femtosecond laser though, because it definitely makes the capsulotomy more precise. There's not all the problems with, trying to tear a capsule when you have very poor traction or counter traction actually with zonules. So having a femtosecond laser created makes one less challenging step. But what am I going to do? Well, in this case, what I did was actually take 5-O-proline suture, create a flange, and then thread that through the eyelet of an Ahmed segment. And you can see how much movement there is just by the little bit of traction there is in the margin of that already created capsulotomy as I try to remove it. There's just very little zonules for at least 180 degrees here. So I don't want to do things that are going to put traction on the opposite side and destroy the zonules that already exist. But now I placed a 27 gauge needle through the conjunctiva and sclera, 2 millimeters posterior to the limbus, right in that area of maximal zonulopathy. And I'm threading the other end of that 5-O-proline with the flange through the Ahmed segment now into that 27 gauge lumen of the needle. And I'm going to help it to go through, so don't pull it out, because that's always a bummer. And I'm going to look at it as it emerges from the sclera and conjunctiva. I'm going to make sure that that's all set. And now I'm introducing the Ahmed segment with that's already attached to the 5-O-proline into the interchamber. And of course, this is always a little bit tough because that flange does kind of catch on things. And I'm going to position it in the area of maximal zonulopathy, kind of like a big, wide capsular hook. And the reason I did it this way is because this is really going to be my final solution for supporting the lens in the long term. So if I'm going to use it then, why not place it now? And then it's one less step later in the surgery, and it provides this broad area of support. So I've created another little flange. It's not at the proper tension yet, but just enough to give support in that area. These cases, it's so important to use copious amounts of dispersive viscoelastic. You can see I've put a second capsular hook in there too on the side that's more intact. So lots and lots of dispersive viscoelastic, gallons and gallons of it if needed. I just feel like these cases, that's your friend. And I'm even doing a little bit of viscodissection of the epinucleus. Look how much, lax there is there and how the whole fornix collapses. But again, you can expand it with the visco, and that allows you to complete the case in a safe manner. Sometimes just removing some of that softer material with viscodissection, and then even getting all of the cortex out, again, with assistance, making sure that I either irrigate it out, use dispersive viscoelastic, or very, very carefully use the INA. And you'll see that I'll do that here in a moment. But this allowed me to already have pretty much my entire support system here. I'm going to add, as you can see here, a capsular tension ring. I like this technique of putting a Sinski through the leading eyelet. It allows me to introduce that with very little additional traction or pulling on the zonules. This is a preloaded CTR, and my assistant is actually pushing the plunger very slowly as I tell them, push forward or stop. And then it goes in that atraumatic fashion. So here we have, good support on the right, that area of maximal zonulopathy with the eyelet of the Ahmed's CTS being supported with that 5-O-proline and 2 phalanges. And even with the CTR in place and those capsular hooks, you can really just gently get all of the cortical material out as well. So it's not that hard. You can put some of these support systems in ahead of time without fearing that you're going to make this last step of removing cortex even more difficult. And then I'll put in the IOL. At that point, the rest of it was pretty straightforward. So
Wow.
surgical pearls here. And then I'm going to ask Zena what she would have done differently. But for this technique, size and centration, the interior capsulotomy is really important. Use capsule hooks. Yep, thank you. Segments, CTRs. You might have to put it in the sulcus even and use optic capture. I've done that, especially when I have limited resources, like when I'm out of the country. And that's a very stable situation as well. Minimize nuclear sculpting, rotation, use careful hydrodelineation and low flow settings. And you really want to just use as much dispersive OVD as you can. And then at the end, I like to put intraocular triamcinolone to check for vitreous. In this case, I did do a little bit of intravitrectomy where some wisps had come around the margin of the capsule. And then use intracameral antibiotics, which I do on every case anyway. So we're going to stop right there for a second. Dana, what would you have done differently?
First of all, that's a beautiful case and so many pearls. I think, I haven't done it using the 5-O-proline. What I do is actually put in the Ahmed segment and then use an iris hook. I'm sorry, I don't know why I can't like pause it from going forward. So I used to do, put an Ahmed segment and then an iris hook. And then after that, at the end, use Gore-Tex. But I love avoiding Gore-Tex because we talked about some of the issues that we have with Gore-Tex and having to do 2 sclerotomies. And then, a couple of pearls that you mentioned, which I think are important. I insert my CTR manually for control, exactly as sort of what you recommended doing. I go through a paracentesis and then have a Sinskey hook through the wound that grabs it and kind of guides it. And because sometimes I struggle when I go in through the opening for sort of removing it. Also, I love the concept of OVD viscodissection before removing cortex, especially before you put that CTR. I think it's really important. Other than that, I think I would have done the exact same thing, but I'm definitely going to do 5-O-proline next time.
So this is another interesting case. I know that this happens when you get those timings in on the slides, Dana. So you could stop sharing and I'll share if you want, and it won't do that. But you let me know.
Okay.
But this case is actually a hospitalist, guy who comes in, really wants a toric lens, really super nice doc in the community, and has this tiny little pupil, of course. It was big enough to do femtosecond laser on the capsulotomy, but I could see all of this rotation and motion going, very poor zonular support, and really a dense lens. And I apologize, this is kind of dark, but this video was a little bit dark that day. But the pearls here are going to be small pupil, really loose zonules. This device really helps me. It's Diamatrix makes it. It's their pupil expander. It's made of nitinol. And it has these sort of 4 pockets that can either expand the pupil and create a really nice pupillar expansion with very tiny profile that doesn't interact or get in the way of any of your instruments, including your phaco handpiece. Or you can take the pockets and actually manipulate them around the capsular edge as well, which is what I did here. So it supports the capsule and gives you a nice stable platform for removing the lens. And it also expands the pupil at the same time. So small profile, flexible options in what you can do with it. So you get it in there, and then that last little loop or pocket, you'll place with something like a Kuglin or a manipulator of some sort. So now you can see I have a nice large pupil and nice stable, a lot of little rocking and rolling going here. This is typical. You have a patient who's got a lot of deep breaths. Very, very dense nucleus. I'm going to use a vertical chopping technique that I prefer and work slowly to get this out, since I know that my zonules are very compromised. But it all comes out, no issue here. Really good support with this system. But now what am I going to do? Because I want to put the toric lens in the bag, and I've got this sort of sandwich between the iris and the capsule. So I don't have a lot of space there to put anything to support this capsule well. And it's very, very loose. So once I get all the cortex and nuclear material out, I'm going to put in a CTR just like we talked about. And you can see that it's actually engaged the edge of the capsule there where the iris is a little bit away from the capsule and gives you that look. So in this case, I didn't use my technique with the Sinskey. I just put the capsular tension ring in directly. I think I felt like there was enough support with that sandwich with the pupil expander. And now I'm going to put in the toric lens, get it really much right, or pretty much right where I want it to be on axis. So I don't have to do a lot of rotation once I've taken off this, capsule support. And I'm doing the same thing. This is 5-O-proline. It's a flange through the eyelet. I'm going to place it into the capsular bag, but I need to do something to create a space in the sulcus. And I'm worried that if I disengage this whole thing, it's all going to fall to the posterior segment. So I'm going to disengage two of the pockets, create a space in the sulcus with viscoelastic on one side, but leave one of the pockets, at least maybe one or two, still engaged so that it's keeping the capsule up at the level of the iris. And I've again placed that 27 gauge needle through the sclera and conjunctiva into the sulcus, threading the free end of the 5-O-proline into that. I'll externalize it, create phalanges, and I'm going to place one 180 degrees away from there as well. The trickiest part is making sure the flange and that little pigtail go on the anterior surface of the capsule. I don't know that it's critical, but I don't like to put extra tension on the margin of the capsule if I don't have to. So I spent a little bit of extra time making sure the flange actually rode above the capsule, just like that end of where the eyelid is of the curlicue of the Ahmed segment. And so there it is, 180 degrees away. And at the end, what you see is a nicely round pupil, really was atraumatic to the margin of the pupil with that pupil expander and a toric lens on axis. This patient had a lot of cylinders. So I think it was like a T7 or T9. And it's very, very well supported. You can move this all around and won't go anywhere.
How do you insert the end of that haptic, or not haptic, but end of the 5-O-proline? Yeah. How do you make sure it goes in the sclera? Tell us a little bit of your pearls.
That's so important. And so, I just have been really enjoying using proline for lots of different things. But that's the key, because everything we talked about with vortex can happen with those little phalanges too. So when I started doing this, I was very interested in making a large flange. My whole thought is it may pull into the eye through the sclera. And really you can make a very small flange. It doesn't need to be huge. Anybody who's tried to remove a Yamane fixated lens knows that. And then use something small. Sometimes I use the end of my Utrata just to push it into the sclera. It's really important that you feel no bump as you go across it with a cannula that's fully underneath the conjunctiva. And you should just barely see that blueness in the superficial layers of the sclera.
Yep,
important.
I agree. And let's talk a little bit, give some credit to Shin Yamane, who really sort of had us think about this, because it was his thought of intrascleral IOL fixation that really made us use 5-O-proline and all of these different things. So here's a sort of the Yamane technique of how I do it. And we'll go in steps, because I did everything wrong when I started doing this technique. And really that's the pearls that I wanted to show you and share with you. Almost everything. I mean, it took me 2 hours to do one of the first cases. But so the placement of your paracenteses are vital. You don't want the pupil to be too large, but you don't want it to be too small either. You definitely want to have an anterior chamber maintainer so that you can have a firm eye when you're doing the sclerotomies. You insert your 3-piece lens. We'll talk a little bit about the different ones. And then you really want to stabilize the eye as you do that scleral tunnel. I used to make it very long, 2 millimeters. Now I'm about 1 millimeter, maybe and a quarter. So I don't need to make it that long, but they have to be 180 degrees away. And the scleral tunnels have to be exactly the same in both locations. Otherwise, you get significant decentration and tilt. And then here, this is the hardest part of the procedure. I like using going across with a paracentesis, 180 degrees away, and then pushing that lens with the needle and then going through it. But really, that's the most difficult part. I use 25 gauge max grip forceps. You can remove each needle separately and cauterize. You can remove both, but you have to be very careful for it not to slip in highly myopic eyes. And then sort of pushing in with that 0.2, Kathy spoke It's the importance of making sure that that goes through and you're not leaving the cauterized edge of the haptic. So let's talk about some of the things that I did wrong. And Kathy, stop me if you want to add anything to it. So, you know, the most important part is to use a special needle. So this is a 30 gauge, but it's a thin walled needle. So it allows the haptic to be inserted easily through it. Some people do use 27 gauge needles, especially a lot of retina surgeons. I worry that that opening is a little bit too large, but again, that's just not what I potentially use. So it's important to use low temp cautery and look at the difference between low and high temp cautery here. So when you're using the low temp cautery, it's slow and controlled creation of the haptic. If you use high temp, it's much faster and you could lose a portion of your haptic and then it'll be harder to make it equal on both sides. I never use. Go ahead.
Really quick. So, you know, on missions, we sometimes don't have every kind of cautery. And so you can use a high temp cautery, just stay further away and approach it slowly. So you're essentially using a lower temperature.
Perfect. And then, so there's 3 different 3-piece lenses you can use. I don't like using the Alcon MA60AC. Look at how curved it is, makes it much harder. And then, of course, the PMMA haptics can break much easier than different lens options. I can easily do it with a ZA9003 because the angle is much better, but it's still a PMMA monofilament in terms of the haptic. So you just have to be really careful in terms of when you have to not push against the angle. So you have to be very, very steady and angled in terms of doing that. Sorry, I don't know what happened here. And then the third, hold on, give me a second. Let me get back to that slide.
While you're doing that, one thing I wanted to say too about introducing the lens, and I think we talked about this early on when we were both trying this technique, is I do still like to put my leading haptic directly from the inserter into the first needle. I think it's very, very controlled. And again, I just have my assistant rotate the inserter, the plunger, in order to slowly deliver it directly into the needle.
Yeah, no, I agree. If you have an assistant, it's much easier to do that. I love the Zeiss CT Lucia because they have the PVDF haptics, and those are very, very hard to break. But you have to be very careful with inserting it. So we talked about sort of the difficult part of the proximal haptic. I like doing it from a paracentesis, grab the haptic parallel, and then about 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters farther than the end, and then inserting it that way. This is one of my earlier cases. So obviously the anterior chamber maintainer should go infranasally instead of exactly in the location where you're trying to put it. But again, I also bend my 25 gauge max grip forcep. Another thing you can do for that proximal haptic location that's easier is to move your wound a little bit to the left. In some of these cases, you're doing it as secondary IOLs or IOL exchanges, so you're not going to do phaco. So the location of your wound is not as important. And so we'll go a little bit faster here, but sort of aim it a little bit to the left so that you have a much larger excursion that you can grab the haptic. And so you can leave the haptic externalized, grab it. Again, I like the parallel aspect, and then just going through the wound might be a little bit easier. And you can see here, when you're using the CT Lucia lens, it doesn't have to be perfect. You saw how it kind of angled that haptic, but it doesn't break. You really can't get away with that if you're doing the ZA9003 lens. So that's really important to do it that way. The other thing to be careful, so what I love about this technique is that you can use a 3-piece lens that's already decentered. This is a 4-year-old that, this is a 7-year-old that had surgery when he was 3. And then this IOL decentered. So I thought, well, let's not make an open large wound. Let's use the 3-piece lens that's already in there and just do the Yamane technique. Unfortunately, one of these older lenses, when you pull, you can easily sort of remove it from the optic haptic junction. And look what I do here. You pull it out, and that's also in terms of the angle of how you grab it. So this is one of my earlier cases. So you have to be very careful with manipulating these lenses. And although this is my go-to technique for most of my cases, we still don't have 30-year data. We don't know how stable this is going to be. So even though we talk about it, we think it's amazing. We have to be a little bit conservative with saying what's going to happen 30 years from now. But again, what I decided to do is remove the old lens, put a new lens, and then ended up this patient having a tube at the same time. And the 3-piece lens was still just as stable postoperatively. So it really is an amazing technique, even in younger patients. But it's important to talk to the parents about sort of what we have in terms of long-term data, which isn't as much. Centration is one of the most important things. And I spend a lot of time here talking about centration. And as you can see here, a couple of things that you can do. If your scleral tunnels are not of equal distance, you can actually cut your haptic on one side. You can cauterize it also instead of cutting it to shorten it in terms of the scleral tunnel. And those are ways to help. But if it's not 180 degrees apart, and if it's pretty much larger of a scleral tunnel, then it's a much bigger issue, and you can't really do that, and you have to actually re-engage. I just want to make sure, are we, Ed, do we end at this time, or do we have 15 more minutes?
No, we're over time now.
Okay, so then
you
we'll
summarize it.
No, we'll stop. I'll just go to my summary slide that has sort of everything. I did want to say optic capture is an issue. Make sure to go about 2.5 millimeters posterior to the limbus to avoid that and doing a PI. You can always exchange it. We just published about aiming minus 0.75 for good refractive outcomes. And then this would be sort of the end summary slide for some of the pearls for people to take a picture for the Yamani technique. And thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it was so much fun to present with you, Zaina, and thank you very much for inviting us.
What a great lecture. I really appreciate it. I love the kind of the team approach to the talk. It's great to hear both opinions and different techniques. I think you've completely satisfied our crowd. I don't see any questions. If there are other questions, people can write them in, and we'll see if we can forward them on so that we can get answers to your questions. Thank you again for your time, Drs. McCabe and Dr. Al-Mu'taseb.